My warm welcome to the London Assembly's first Mayor's Question Time meeting of 2021. Good morning to everyone. In accordance with the government's regulations, we are holding this meeting on a virtual basis, with Assembly members and the Mayor participating remotely. Members of the public are able to access the meeting online via the webcast. So you're very welcome to join us for this morning's meeting. Can I ask our clerk, Rebecca Arnold, to confirm the names of the members who are present at this morning's meeting, and any apologies received from members as well, please?
Thank you very much, Chair. We have with us virtually Assemblymember Arnold, Assemblymember Bailey, Berry, Cooper, Desai, Devonish, Dismore, Duval, Eshalomi, Gavron, Hall, Curtin, McCartney, Dr. Moore, O'Connell, Pigeon, Prince, Qureshi, Russell, Dr. Sahota, Whittle, Deputy Chairman, Assemblymember Arbour, yourself, the Chair, Assemblymember Shah, and Assemblymember Boff as well, I can see, has joined us, and we just have one apology, which is from Assemblymember Bacon, Chair.
Thank you so much for that. Like we always do, let's start the meeting with Chair's announcements. So can I provide an update on some of the recent Assembly activities that we had? The London Assembly held an extraordinary plenary meeting on 12th of January to discuss urgent and emerging issues related to COVID-19 impact on London and Londoners. The Budget and Performance Committee published a number of reports last week on the Mayor's budget plans for 2021-22 and made a number of recommendations on the proposed budget plans for TfL, MOPEC, London Fire Brigade, and other important areas of our work. The Fire, Resilience and Emergency Planning Committee published a report on the cladding crisis in London. The report called on the Mayor to provide legal and mental health support to Londoners impacted by cladding and fire safety issues. And finally, last week, the Police and Crime Committee questioned the Deputy Mayor for Policing and Crime and Deputy Commissioner of the Met Police on the Mayor's action plan and quizzed if it is consistent with the Mayor's objectives in that area of work. Right, moving on to declarations of interest. Can I ask the Assembly to note the recommendations set out in item 2? I believe that's agreed.
Noted.
Can I ask Assembly members to declare any other disclosable pecuniary interests or other relevant interests where they relate to the items on the agenda for today's meeting? Are there any such interests? I believe none, so let's proceed. Can I ask the Assembly to confirm the minutes of London Assembly's plenary meeting held on 11th December and the Assembly's Mayor's Question Time meeting held on 17th of December 2020 to be signed by me as correct record?
Agreed.
Thank you very much. We now move on to the Mayor's report. Can I ask the Assembly formally to receive the Mayor's report covering the period from 4th December 2020 to 7th January 2021. The Mayor will now provide an oral update of up to 5 minutes in length on matters occurring since the publication of his report. Mr. Mayor, good morning, and the floor is yours.
Good morning. Good morning, Navin. Since the last Mayor's Question Time, there have been some major developments in our fight against COVID-19. Londoners have been making huge sacrifices to follow the national lockdown restrictions. And whilst there are some early signs that the rapid increase in cases we've seen is levelling off, in the last 24 hours, 239 Londoners have lost their lives to this virus, the second highest number of daily deaths in London since the pandemic began. The highest was on April the 10th last year. I continue to urge Londoners to follow the lockdown rules and to stay at home unless it's absolutely necessary. The rollout of the vaccines means that we can finally see some light at the end of the tunnel. We're now in a race against time to vaccinate as many people as possible, as quickly as possible, in order to save lives and prevent yet more damage to our economy, businesses and livelihoods. The government's original distribution formula meant that London initially missed out on its fair share of vaccines. That's why I urgently called on the government to correct this error and to take action to scale up delivery. And I can report that the Minister for COVID vaccine deployment, Nadeem Zahawi, has personally assured me that supply will increase and that the right amount of the vaccine, which reflects our city's size, density and level of need, will now be provided. Another major concern we have is the misinformation that's been spread about the vaccines. As Mayor, I'm doing all I can to reassure Londoners that the vaccine is both safe and effective, and I'd encourage others to do the same. I also want to briefly touch on the Brexit trade deal that was agreed before Christmas, because incredibly, financial services, which is such a crucial part of London's economy, has been completely neglected in the deal. There's no getting around the fact it was effectively a no-deal Brexit for finance. So this week I've called on politicians and businesses to speak up about this mistake and to push the government to secure improvements to the Brexit deal, as well as to oppose any race to the bottom through reckless deregulation. For my part as Mayor, I'll continue to bang the drum around the globe for London's financial sector and be a champion for the world-leading services they provide. Chair, I look forward to answering questions during the course of this morning, but I have been asked for one request for an oral report, an oral update in relation to the GTR timetable from Assembly Member Pigeon. Keeping customers and staff safe has been at the heart of everything TfL has done during this pandemic. TfL is keeping a close eye on the issue raised and is in close contact with government and the train operating companies. TfL understands that these reduced timetables are not intended to be in place for long and will continue to work with the train operating companies to address any areas of concern and pass on intelligence. I know that TfL has raised concerns about proposed changes to C2C services running through stations such as Barking and West Ham. Fewer but more tightly packed trains arriving at these stations could result in more concentrated flows of people down to tube platforms. I want to reassure the Assembly member that TfL is doing all it can to enable people to socially distance on its network. We're seeking to run the maximum service possible given staff availability and have been clear that significant service cuts in the longer term would be detrimental to London's post-pandemic recovery. As well as maintaining service levels as far as possible, TfL continues to closely monitor its network, ensuring the right tools are in place to enable social distancing, as well as providing targeted customer information about the busiest times and locations. I welcome the government's support in requesting that the construction sector stagger its start times, something TfL has been communicating to the sector for many months and has reiterated in recent days. It's vital that customers continue to avoid the busiest times between 8:15 a.m. Before 8:15 a.m. and between 4 p.m. and 5:30 p.m. on weekdays. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you very much for that, Mr. Mayor. We now move on to the questions on the priority order paper.
Chair,
Yes,
sorry,
indeed.
Chair, I did raise my hand, sir.
Chair, I did.
Right. Assembly Member Prince, followed by Assembly Member Desai.
Thank you, Chair. First of all, Mr. Mayor, well done in relation to getting more vaccines for London. Applaud that. Thank you. Secondly, the update is obviously supposed to update us on things that have happened since your last report. Well, there was a rather big event yesterday, Mr. Mayor, in relation to the court case between TfL and LTDA and UTAG. Perhaps you might like to update us on that?
Chair, TfL are appealing against the judgment at first instance. It's clearly a case ongoing, so it's probably not appropriate for me to comment in relation to appeals to the Court of Appeal.
Having said that, the question I would like to ask you, though, Mr. Mayor, is around actually, do you think it's sensible to appeal? I don't know how much the action has cost so far. Perhaps you could let us know that. That wouldn't affect the case, but surely that's going to cost even more money. And from what the judge has said, your chances of winning a case are quite remote.
We'll have to wait and see how the appeal pans out, but the advice from counsel is that it is worth appealing. Clearly, I'm not going to discuss legal advice publicly, but we wouldn't be appealing if we didn't think it was worth appealing.
And what about the costs, Mr. Mayor? What have the costs been so far?
Well, one of the factors, of course, when it comes to any court cases, the cost of the policy we're discussing. We know the consequences of poor air quality. We know we don't want to replace one health crisis, the COVID crisis, with another. We know the cost to the NHS and to productivity with illnesses caused by respiratory issues. It's that counted versus the cost of an appeal.
But some of the comments made by the judge were quite damning, Mr. Mayor. Would you not want to address those in the meantime?
Often cases in the first instance where one loses, the comments aren't ones you'd welcome, and that's why we live in a country where there are appeals allowed. We have natural justice, due process and the rule of law. Thank goodness for that.
But do you not regret the fact that the comments were really quite damning against TfL and I mean, we can't discuss the detail obviously, but surely you would have you can lose. It's like a game of football, isn't it? You know, you can lose 1-0 unluckily, or like this one looks like a 4-0 slaughter to me.
Well, somebody who's actually practiced law, it's not uncommon to lose at first instance, win at appeal, or win at first instance and lose at appeal. And let's wait and see how the appeal pans out.
Yeah, definitely TfL need more practice, that's for sure. I'll leave it at that. Thank you.
Thank you. Assembly Member Desai, very welcome back and good to see you in good health.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you, Chair. Good morning, colleagues. Good morning, Mr. Mayor. Mr. Mayor, it seems that there has been a breakdown in communication somewhere along the line, but an email was sent to your office drawing your attention to the ongoing dispute at British Gas. Essentially, the issue is one of what is called fire and rehire, where employees are basically re-employed on lower terms, on worse terms and conditions, attack on pensions rights. 89% of the British Gas employees elected by the GMB trade union voted in favour of industrial action. The first round of industrial action was last week. The second round started yesterday. You don't have to comment this morning necessarily, but if you could respond to my email. But I just want to say this on behalf of GMB union, nationally and London region. Our members want to get back to work serving British Gas customers, but they've been left with no choice. The company must withdraw the threat of fire and rehire and get back on the negotiating table.
Well, firstly, Chair, can I just echo your comments? It's great to see the Assembly member back in good health, having fought off the awful virus. Can I thank the Assembly member for writing to me, and can I also give him the news that I've not just been in touch with the interim General Secretary for the fantastic trade union GMB, Warren Kenny, but I've also written to British Gas because the Assembly member raises some really important issues. What we can't see is a situation where employers are using the pandemic as an excuse to make changes which, frankly speaking, are unacceptable. What I'll do, Chair, is to continue to keep the member in the loop in relation to representations I've had with British Gas. Can I thank him, though, for raising this really important issue? There are thousands of Londoners who work incredibly hard for this company. It's really important they're treated with decency and with dignity. This is 2021, not the Victorian ages.
Thank you very much, Mr. Mayor, on behalf of the GMB Trade Union. Thank you.
Thank you. Can I also invite Assembly Member Andrew Buff, who's indicated he wants intervention, please? Assembly Member Buff.
We warned you that the street space scheme at Bishopsgate neglected the interests of disabled people, and the High Court has now confirmed this to be the case. When considering the costs of your appeal against the High Court's judgment, how much more are you willing to spend to neglect the interests of disabled people?
Well, Chair, I don't accept the premise of a number of points raised in the question, but as I said in answer to a previous question, we've looked at the judgment and the advice from counsel is it's worth an appeal. Let's wait and see how the appeal pans out.
Mr. Mayor, if you fail with this appeal, will you be replacing your Deputy Mayor for Transport?
No.
If she were to resign, would you accept her resignation?
She's got no intention of resigning. She's a fantastic Deputy Mayor. With the previous Deputy Mayor, Val Shawcross, the best two Deputy Mayors this city's had since at least 2008, and I'd argue since the GLA was set up.
When you set up the London Recovery Board, the RSPB had a seat at the table but not the disabled. I had to implore you to ensure that that was remedied. How are you going to improve your administration's blind spot when involving disabled people?
One of the legacies that we've been dealing with over the last 4 years is the poor track record the previous mayor had and the GLA had dealing with not just disabled groups.
I'm talking about your record, Mr. Mayor, not your predecessor. It was you that neglected to put a person on the London Recovery Board who could represent the disabled. So let's talk about your record. Let's not do some diversion onto somebody else.
Made your point, Mr. Mayor.
He's made a number of points. He just doesn't like the response, which is what happens when you rebut to poor points.
What I don't like, Mr. Mayor, is the fact that you're not involved with disabled people.
Again.
Look, we've had all this before.
Are you always angry?
Remember, Bob, you raised this issue before. We know the divergence.
Mr. Mayor, somebody has to get angry on behalf of disabled people who are being ignored by your administration. So I do not apologise for that.
This is question and answer session. Can you ask further question if you have? Otherwise, I'd like to move on because I have other indications as well. Right? I'm going to move on.
Well, Chair, let me respond to the various points he raised because he didn't like the answer I was giving, which is one of the downsides of having a mayor, unlike the previous one, on top of his brief. So let me deal with the question. Let me deal with the question raised, and if you could just calm down for a second and be less angry, I can respond to the points he raised. So when I took over as mayor, not unreasonably, I assumed that the previous mayor had positions, people in place who would advise the mayor and the GLA in relation to a whole host of issues. Unfortunately, what I hadn't factored in is that the previous mayor and the GLA as it was then wasn't properly engaging with disabled Londoners and disabled groups. What I've done as mayor is sought to rebuild those relationships with not only disability groups across London, but trying to bring in new people around the table rather than usual suspects. And we have got really good engagement with disabled groups. One of the reasons why we were able to have the biggest run of step-free access that our city's ever seen is because of our engagement with those disabled groups. And we continue to make progress in relation to the skills agenda, in relation to jobs, in relation to public transport, in relation to air quality, in relation to crime, addressing some of the big issues that have concern to disabled Londoners. And I'm really pleased that we have expertise advising the London Recovery Board, including from the disabled groups as well. Independent advice that I think adds value to the GLA.
How did your predecessor get involved with the setup of the London Recovery Board? Whose fault was it that there was no representation for disabled people on that board?
What normally happens, and I'm surprised that the member who's been around for some time doesn't know this, is that the officers rely upon the usual contacts that the GLA has when it comes to setting up new forums. So, for example...
So it was the officers' fault,
so when it comes to...
Can you allow... Mr. Mayor, carry on.
He doesn't like the answer. It's an old sixth-form debate.
I don't like the evasion, Mr.
Interrupt, which is to interrupt the answer. Because he doesn't like the...
Assembly Member Bob, can you please allow him to answer the question?
Thank
you. Yeah.
Just calm down.
Sorry about that.
So what happened was, because usually when it comes to boards being set up and fora being set up before 2016, very little engagement from disabled activists, disabled groups. I'm really pleased though. We've got not just disabled disability activists advising us, but also experts in equality issues as well. Again, another area other than disability discrimination not addressed by the previous mayor. We're rectifying that, and we've now got a really good team in place to advise on a whole host of issues.
Thank you, Chair.
Right. I know that my advice of not speaking over each other, etc., is falling on deaf ears. But please, can you try and have a dignified debate so that the issues are properly put and issues are properly understood by the viewers who are very keen to see what the key issues and questions and answers are. So let's try and have a decent discussion this morning. The first question is entitled Cost of Living, which is in the name of Assembly Member Bailey. Mr. Mayor.
Well, thank you, Chair. I've done all I can to reduce the cost of living for Londoners. We've started more genuinely affordable homes than ever before, and we're on track to meet our target of 116,000 starts by March 2023. Our £1 billion investment has led to the most new council home starts in the capital since 1983. We've launched London Power to reduce energy costs. We've worked with employers to help them offer their staff interest-free loans for childcare and rental deposits. The living wage in London has risen to £10.85 an hour, and there's been a 150% increase in the number of accredited living wage employers headquartered in London since I became mayor, to over 2,000. Under the previous mayor, fares increased by 42%, but I introduced the unlimited hopper bus fare and froze TfL fares for 5 years, saving the average London household over £200. In the past year, the pandemic has hit our public finances hard, and TfL's fare revenue dropped by up to 90%. While the London gave the private rail companies a bailout with no strings attached, they imposed requirements on TfL that seemed designed to hit the vulnerable the hardest. I managed to fight off proposals to scrap concessions for under 18s and over 60s and expand the congestion charge zone to the north and south circular roads. But to keep TfL running, I had to accept the government's requirement for fares to rise by RPI +1 overall. To limit the impact of this, I've managed to keep some fares frozen. The government has told us also that we'd have to put up council tax to fund TfL services. Some government supporters predicted council tax would go up by up to 21%, but we've managed to limit the increase in council tax by an average £2.63 a month from this April. With both fares and council tax, it's the same story. The government seeking to impose additional costs on Londoners, whilst I do everything I can to limit the damage done to the cost of living. And it's worth remembering that my political opponents consistently opposed my fares freeze, which has saved Londoners more in each of the last 5 years than the cost of the council tax increase. I've also been asking the government to make the £20 temporary increase to universal credit permanent and take further steps to ensure benefits cover the basic costs of living. I was disappointed that only six Conservative MPs voted to maintain the high level of universal credit in Parliament in a vote this Monday.
Morning, Mr. Mayor, and thank you for your answer. You have said that council tax is regressive and affects the poorest most in London. So your very large council tax increase will hammer the poor across London. Will you reconsider this idea?
Well, the only reason why we have to increase council tax is because the government are forcing us to do so. There's 3 areas where they've forced us to do so. In the first area, in relation to policing, we know from previous experience that if we don't increase the council tax to the maximum the government requires us to do so, in the following year, they reduce money from police budgets. So in my first year as mayor, one of the reasons given by the Home Secretary to reduce police funding was because in the previous year, the previous mayor hadn't increased council tax to the maximum preset. The second area where we're forced to increase council tax is to support the fire service, particularly important as we receive about 20% less in money for the fire brigade than the government thinks we should, but also because of the consequences of both the Grenfell Tower fire, but also we know the problems with the built environment. And the third part where there's had to be an increase in council tax is because the government has said they refuse to support us funding free travel for under 18s, and they refuse to support us to fund free travel for over 60s. I'm not willing to accede to government demands to take those away. The only way the government's allowed us to pay for those is one of two options, either to increase further the congestion charge or to increase council tax. I've chosen to keep those concessions and to introduce this council tax increase because there's no other option if we want to keep free travel for under 18s and over 60s.
But you've said that you'll find £730 million in savings from TfL. Why wasn't this done earlier? You could have addressed these things that way. But let me move on. You have...
Do you want me to respond to that point?
By all means.
Sure. So since I've become mayor, for the first time in TfL's history, which was formed in 2000, the operating costs of TfL have been going down year on year. So 2016, 2017, 2018, 2019, 2020, each year they've been going down. In the previous 16 years, they were going up. We've managed to reduce our deficit that we have by more than £1 billion as well, and managed to increase our cash balances. So according to all independent experts, TfL has made huge transformations over the last 4 or 5 years, something as the chair of TfL I'm incredibly proud of. On top of that, we're going to make more savings over the course of the next period, which we're required to do by the government. The danger is, if we're not careful, it may lead to a reduction in services, which should be not the sensible thing to do as we come into recovery post the pandemic.
Your proposed London boundary charge is hugely unwelcome across London, particularly in areas such as Hillingdon and Romford on the outskirts of London. Will you take into account residents' views on the outskirts of London as this proposal moves forward?
Well, firstly, Chase, I always think it's important to correct errors made by members when it comes to their questions. So in relation to the Greater London charge, it's not my proposal to bring in this charge. This is one of the options the government asked us to do in relation to what further ways we could raise revenues. The better option is for the government to give London the £500 million raised from Londoners through the vehicle excise duty, what's called road tax. So if the government was to give us the money Londoners pay into VED, there'd be no reason for this to be one of the options that the Financial Stability Report, Sustainability Report, has put forward to the government. We wouldn't be doing this if the government won't require us to do so. But it's not a proposal from me, it's one of the options TfL's put forward to the government as they asked us to do.
If you had better control of London's finances, you wouldn't have to raise council tax by this month. We've had a £58 million increase in executive pay, £151 million.
And let me deal with each of those.
Question.
Excuse me?
Well, let me deal with...
Assembly Member Bailey, can we have a question, please?
Yeah, we will get to it. I stopped because the mayor interjected. The point is, better control of London's finances would really help you reduce the costs on Londoners rather than your immediate response just to pass that on in a council tax rise. Do you not believe the triple whammy of a council tax raise, a boundary charge, and keeping the inflated congestion charge will have a massive effect, negative, on us recovering the economy in London?
Well, Chair, it seems that Trump may have gone, but fake news hasn't. Let me address each of those points raised in the question from the member, who really should know better, as somebody who's now been a member for 4 years. He's not a novice anymore, I hope. So TfL relies upon fares from passengers to pay for its services. 72% of our services are paid for by the fares box. On top of that, we rely upon advertising revenues, and on top of that, property revenues. Roughly speaking, 86% by those three areas. Now, I'm surprised the member hasn't seen the impact on London's economy caused by the pandemic. But for the pandemic, we'd have had healthy income streams in all three of those areas: fares, property, and advertising revenues. All transit authorities across the country, including the privatised train operating companies, have seen a massive fall in fares revenue. The government gave the privatised train operating companies a blank cheque for 18 months, but has not given TfL the same level of support. Whether such a TfL is, will give you short-term assistance on condition of doing a number of things. One of the conditions is to increase the congestion charge to £15 7 days a week. Another condition is to remove free travel from under 18s and over 60s. But for us to keep those free travel for under 18s and over 60s, a condition was we had to increase the council tax if we weren't willing to increase the congestion charge even further. So it's really important, and I'm sure over the course of the next 100 or so days, Chair, many of us will be reminding Londoners of this, for Londoners to be aware who's responsible for an increase in an aggressive tax, whether it's to pay for policing, to pay for transport, or to pay for the fire service. And I'm not apologetic. I want to make sure that we fund the police service, the fire service and transport, which is really important after 10 years of cuts.
Well, let's be clear, Mr. Mayor. London's poor financial situation is because of decisions you have made. You've been consistently warned about your profligate way of spending Londoners' money. You weren't told to make those changes.
That's just fake news, Chair. It's just a lie. I mean,
decisions that are for you to make that you.
Where's the question? Where's the question?
The decisions that you have made,
chair the meeting.
you should regret. And one last thing, Mr. Mayor, it's very strange that you compare me to Trump. Why? Put it back up.
Because you are.
Well, look, Chair, I've been asked a question. Chair, I've been asked a question.
Carry on, Mr. Mayor.
So if you look at the methods and devices used by Donald Trump, both when he was a candidate but also when he won, you will see he used fake news, misinformation, and misleading people. One of the big differences between you and Donald Trump is he won his election, you won't.
Well, I'd like to suggest maybe you're like Trump because you tell an awful lot of lies, Mr. Mayor, an awful lot.
Did your spin doctors honestly advise you
Right.
that's the best line of attack
That's
today to compare me to Donald Trump?
Where's the question in that?
Can we get back to question and answer?
Yes, we can.
please?
Over to you,
Thank
Chair.
you.
Back to you. Thank you very much.
And can I also remind colleagues that I am chairing the meeting. I would appreciate that you allow me to have that control and conduct the meeting in a proper, orderly fashion. I have two indications in terms of supplementaries, Mr. Mayor, to you. First, I invite Assemblymember Duval, followed by Assemblymember Prince. Thank you.
That was an incredulous bit of questioning there, Mr. Mayor. Would you accept that there is a wide-ranging measures that can be helped to support people around, particularly the poor, around cost of living? You've made the case of what you've done in that sense, but wouldn't you say the previous questioner would have more credibility if he had been speaking up for Londoners on free school meals and the government fiasco over that, on issues around the concession passes, around that, because if you want to help the poor and in terms of the cost of living, he could do that. And I think you were very right about pointing out about the tactics. But really, Mr. Mayor, my second part of the question, very quickly, is this. There are people, the Conservatives in particular, and particularly on this group, speak about helping the poor on one issue when it's about you, forget about it with the government, and then they make excuses. They make excuses to help the poor. And this is a quote I want to give you just to reflect on, and I know you'd never say this, but actually the previous questioner did. The key thing about poverty and the poor people is poverty is it's much about a mindset as it's about money. If you give poor people lots of money, they buy things and not always what they need, and they buy what you want. That's the excuse that they don't do some of the things that you've done in protecting the most vulnerable people in London and trying to support them in these hard times. Would you just generally, in terms of correct around the range of issues and particularly where government's interventions could be helpful in supporting Londoners?
I find those comments attributed to a member of this Assembly offensive, and I'm more than happy to give him the opportunity to apologise. Even says that a U-turn, he's changed his mind. Even that would be something that I'm sure all of us would welcome. His silence speaks volumes. And we can only infer from his silence, when he's got the opportunity now to respond to those comments, he still believes that. And I think anybody who still believes that is not fit, not just to not be the mayor, but not to be a member of this Assembly.
Right. Assemblymember Prince, do you want to?
Mayor, could I give way to Assemblymember Bailey first, who's been named?
Well, if he wants to reply, I don't think he's indicated he wants to reply.
I have indicated, Chair. I
Doesn't want to apologise.
have indicated, Chair.
Okay, then please ask your question.
First and foremost, in you, Mayor, we have someone who constantly shifts the blame, never takes
Why don't
responsibility.
you respond to Len's point? Do you
I
accept
am
his
responding
comments?
to his point.
Do you apologise for them?
You let me answer.
U-turn.
You let me answer, Mr. Mayor. I'll answer. In you, we have someone who constantly shifts the blame, never takes responsibility. My comments come from 20 years plus of working with some of the hardest
You
situations.
maintain those comments.
Look,
He's not apologising.
You
Unbelievable.
maintain those comments, Chair. He still
Assemblymember
believes
Bailey,
that about poorer people.
Assemblymember Bailey, you were named, so I'm giving you an opportunity if you wanted to sort of take up that particular point. If not,
Chair.
I'd like to go back to
Position.
question answer, please.
Thank you, Chair. And I'd
Position
love to do
now.
that if the members and the mayor stopped intervening.
Look,
Right.
you've been
So as I was
asked to
saying-
apologize.
No, as I was saying, Chair, I've worked with some of Londoners in tough positions for over 20 years of my professional life. People who are drug addicted, people who are crime involved, gang related. So when those comments were made, they were very relevant to the people they're dealing with. I and like the mayor, take responsibility for the people around me. I, like the mayor, I'm not busy trying to pass the buck. The mayor wasn't forced to make these decisions. He's decided to make these decisions and hidden them behind sweet words. But ultimately, he wasn't forced to raise council tax. He decided to raise council tax. That's a decision the mayor took all on his own.
Assembly Member Bailey, yeah, thank you. You made your statement. You obviously have not taken up a request to apologise. We'll move on.
I'm sorry, Chair. No, Chair, with respect,
ask me to apologise. I understand communities far more than he ever will. He's hidden in his ivory tower. I've been on the streets dealing with people.
Oh, Chair, this is not
I'm not spending their money on correct things.
Assembly Member Bailey.
Mayor thinks he can nonsense. I'm saying to him, get out of your ivory tower, do your job. Come and see people are really suffering rather than have your members piling behind you and try and make you look good. You're not helping others. You're not doing what's required.
No one can make you look good.
Assembly Member Bailey, you had enough opportunity.
Thank you.
Assembly Member, Mr. Mayor, I'll give you a minute at the most if you want. A lot's been said in the statement. If you want to come back just for about a minute.
Chair, no need. I'm just making sure that we've recorded what he said.
All right, thank you. Assembly Member Prince.
Thank you, Chair. Very quickly, Mr. Mayor, in relation to the border tax, this will be devastating for my patch, Havering and Redbridge, both of which are border towns. And also, will you be doing an EIA on that before you introduce it, Mr. Mayor?
Well, Chair, firstly, can I just say, I know Keith Prince incredibly well, and I'm sure he doesn't think about poor people the way Sean Bailey does. But in relation to the so-called, inverted commas, border tax, there are no proposals. And if he really feels that strongly about the financial sustainability report's options, what he should do is lobby his government to give TfL the monies raised from London through the vehicle excise duty. How does he explain to his residents how the money they pay in road tax is taken out of London and spent elsewhere? And what he needs to do is to persuade his friends in government to return to London the money raised through road tax. So the TfL doesn't need to consider the other options they're being forced to consider.
Well, Mr. Mayor, as you know, there is cross-party support for that argument around the VED, the vehicle exercise duty tax. So I'll tell you what, I'll put a challenge back to you. I will jointly with you, and I suspect the other group leaders, I will jointly write with you to the Secretary of State asking for the VED to be given to Londoners. How about that?
Chair, can I just thank the member? I mean, people think we have knockabout stuff. This is a really good example of joint working on a cross-party basis. And as ever, the members risen to the occasion. And Chair, with your agreement, why don't the leaders of the various groups do a joint letter? Keith Prince, I'm hoping to speak for the Conservatives, say for their candidate for the mayoral contest. We'll see if we can get agreement from cross-party leaders to do a joint letter. And can I just say, Chair, for those who saw the unimpressive behaviour of the last Conservative speaker, just to show there is cross-party agreement on other issues, and I'm more than happy to write the joint letter to Grant Shapps on the basis outlined by Keith Prince.
Well, thank you, Mr. Mayor, and on that happy note, I would like to move on to the next question, but before we do that, my apology to Assembly Member Curtin, because before we started this first question on priority order paper, Assembly Member Curtin had wanted to sort of come in with his question. I'm not sure if we moved on, but Assembly Member Curtin, if you do want to come back in on the earlier comments and questions, please do so now.
Thank you, Chair. I would like to, if I may, and the question does relate to follow on from some of the earlier points made about the judgment yesterday about the street space scheme. It's disappointing that you are appealing that judgment. What do you say to taxi drivers, particularly who are affected very, very negatively by not being able to drive along Bishopsgate? Well,
there are two separate issues, Chair. Firstly, sorry, good morning, David. Two separate issues. One is the issue of us helping taxi drivers, particularly during the pandemic, and TfL will continue to do what we can. The biggest issue with the taxi drivers is, like many other businesses, they've lost customers because nobody's out and about needing a taxi. So we'll continue to work with taxi drivers to support that industry. The second issue is the merits or demerits of the particular case going to court. The judgment has been made. I always respect judgments. But the advice is it's worth appealing, and so we will be appealing to the Court of Appeal. We'll continue to engage, David, with taxi drivers to address any things that can be addressed in that particular stretch of Bishopsgate. But the policy is one that's a pan-London policy to try and reduce people riding on cars, encouraging more to use public transport. But if there's any specific ideas he's got...
Mr. Mayor, thank you. Specifically, will you open Bishopsgate entirely to taxi drivers now?
Well, we're going to appeal the judgment yesterday, but we always on any temporary scheme see if they can be improved. That's without prejudice to any appeal, and I'm sure TfL will see if there's any improvement that can be made on any scheme that's currently in London that's temporary.
Well, I think you should, Mr. Mayor, but I'll leave it there because of time issues. Thank you.
Thank you. We now move on to a question which Assembly Member Whittle has raised, which is about New Year's fireworks display. Mr. Mayor.
Thank you, Chair. I'm incredibly pleased with the public's heartfelt response to the New Year's fireworks display, drone and laser display. 2020 was one of the most challenging years in living memory for both our city and the country as a whole. I'm very pleased that whilst we could not gather together as we usually would to welcome in the new year, we're able to help the public unite from the comfort of their own homes through this spectacular show. The eyes of the world turned to landmarks across our capital to reflect on the defining moments of 2020 and look in hope to the new year. This included paying tribute to our NHS heroes who continue to work tirelessly to save lives, and heroes like Captain Sir Tom Moore, who lifted our spirits and helped raise millions of pounds for the NHS. It also included recognising the importance and impact of the Black Lives Matter movement on millions of people's lives. Racism continues to affect the lives of many Londoners, and we've all seen this year how COVID disproportionately impacted people from Black, Asian and minority ethnic communities. I'm glad we could show that London always stands together against racism. There was a record-breaking 19 million views of the show live, with more than 39 million views overall. The public's reaction, whether that is from London, across the country or from around the world, has been overwhelmingly positive. Londoners have always stood together in the face of adversity. I was very pleased that we could reflect how this spirit carried them through 2020.
Assembly Member Whittle. Hello.
Hi. Thank you for your answer, Mr. Mayor. Belated Happy New Year to you too. Can I just ask a couple of questions to begin with? Can you confirm that the amount of money used on the fireworks was of taxpayers' money was 1.5, as been reported, 1.5 million?
We haven't got the exact figure, but that sounds about right. But I can send the member the accurate figure once we've got that in.
Thank you. And also, it's correct that you had final sign-off on the display, even though it was done with people like the BBC?
Yeah.
I see. Mr. Mayor, my problem is this, that a lot of people turned into the fireworks, like I did, only to be terribly disappointed by the politicisation of what should be basically a very uniting and harmless event, i.e. fireworks at the end of the year and at the beginning of the year. And what happened is that they were confronted with, you just mentioned their Black Lives Matter, they were confronted with the very recognisable symbol now of the Black Lives Matter movement. Mr. Mayor, this movement believes in defunding the police. It believes in deconstructing the family, history and capitalism. Why did you celebrate it?
I think that the movement is in danger of confusing individual organisations, the movement and the causes behind the movement. What the movement is about in this country in particular is about highlighting and fighting against the racism, inequality and discrimination that still exists, particularly against black people. And over the course of the last year, one of the defining moments was the horrible killing of George Floyd in Minnesota, Minneapolis, the USA. And that's what's led to a groundswell of Londoners and people across the country coming together, uniting against racism, inequality and discrimination, and that's what it's about, not the other issues he's referred to.
Mr. Mayor, that is disingenuous of you. The Black Lives Matter movement, as it was celebrated in that fist, which was then in the middle of a firework display, right? They have very particular aims, which they're very clear about. They're not sort of resigning from them. They're very clear about it. I'm just surprised that, certainly, for example, as the chief policeman in London, that you would agree or celebrate a group that believes that the police should be defunded. Can I just ask you this? When you did or worked out the display, did you know that Black Lives Matter movement had in October already applied to become a political party?
Again, I think he's in danger of conflating individual organisations with the movement and the cause. I'm quite clear. One of the defining moments of 2020 was the world uniting against the racism, inequality, discrimination against black people all across the globe, including in London. I'm not apologetic at all of being anti-racist and not apologetic at all of being a supporter and an ally of the Black Lives Matter movement.
Well, I'm not surprised, Mr. Mayor, but the implication that somehow or other that to be anti-racist you have to support the Black Lives Matter movement is one that I reject. It's just absolutely not true. I think that the point is that this movement has applied and is still being considered to actually be a party. So you could end up facing them in the forthcoming elections. Can I just say also one thing? You talk about these images that you used in this display. I don't think any display really should have images that basically divide people anyway. But one of the most important images of last year was the desecrated statue of Churchill. It was everywhere. That happened during a BLM.
Can you ask your question, please?
Perhaps, Mr. Mayor, do you not think it might have been a more healing thing to have actually had an image, for example, of that statue, but not desecrated?
Well, I agree. The statue of Churchill is really important, and it's really important that it's not desecrated. It's really important there isn't graffiti or vandalism taking place on Winston Churchill's statue or others. He was our great wartime leader. He was the leader of our country and the Allies in defeating fascism across the globe. I'm really proud of his statue in Parliament Square. It's really important that we do what we can to protect that statue, and that's why the police took the steps they did last year to protect the statues. All of us should be outspoken in our views in relation to making sure we stand up to anybody who thinks it's okay to denigrate the statue of Winston Churchill.
That would have been a very good way to maybe illustrated that point, actually, by putting it in the display instead of the BLM logo. But anyway, my time's up, Mr. Mayor, so thank you.
Thank you, Peter.
Thank you. Next question is from Assemblymember Barry. That's about net loss of council homes.
Right, thank you, Chair. Building more council housing is one of my top priorities as Mayor. In 2018, I realised, beg your pardon, Chair, in 2018 I released over £1 billion to councils through my landmark Building Council Homes for Londoners programme. Last year, council started over 4,390 new homes in London, of which 3,300 were supported by City Hall, the highest number since 1983. I'm proud of the success of this programme and the hard work of boroughs. My new £4 billion affordable homes programme will provide even further critical investment for new council homes in London. However, the evidence shows London's housing sector needs significantly more grant, £4.9 billion per year for the next 10 years, to meet the capital's level of affordable housing need. I'm calling on the government to step up and provide this investment. With the number of new council homes growing year on year, there is now only a slight decline in the overall stock of council housing in London, last year by less than 0.1%, representing the smallest decline since 1991, when records began. I'm hopeful that my policies, combined with the ambition and hard work of boroughs, will see this small decline turn into an increase for the first time in 30 years. I'm doing everything I can to make this happen. My new London plan requires that any existing council home lost to demolition are replaced by new housing at existing or higher densities with at least the equivalent level of floor space. The introduction of my 2018 Good Practice Guide to Estate Regeneration ensures that where GLA funding is sought, future demolitions only happen with the support of affected residents. Over time, the combined impact of these policies should ensure demolitions do not lead to a further reduction in council housing stock in the capital. However, it's clear that we're swimming against the tide of national government policies that hamper the efforts of councils to build homes. The government's right to buy policy is a major impediment to the sustained growth of council homes in London. It's clear that one-for-one replacements are not being achieved in London or elsewhere as a result of unfair restrictions placed on the council's use of right to buy receipts to fund new homes. If, like us, the government is serious about providing the homes Londoners need, it must remove these unnecessary restrictions to ensure boroughs can build at a rate that matches their ambition.
Thank you very much, Mr. Mayor. And I think we both have the same goal in mind here, which is more council homes. That's what Londoners need. And it's good to see the increase in council house building since 2016. That is progress. But it doesn't mean London's turned a corner in terms of the net loss of council homes on the ground. That's my topic today. Now, to track what's happening on the ground, I put out a report last week that talks about the planning pipeline, but today I've compiled data from the stock returns from councils. These have the overall numbers, plus information on new builds, acquisitions, demolitions, sell-offs and right to buys. Adding them up, we get the net change, and we're still seeing every year council homes being lost in London, more than are being built or acquired. Now, one of the biggest components of the net loss is, as you'd expect, as you've mentioned, right to buy. Last year, up to 2020, nearly 1,500 homes were lost that way in London. So starting with something we can agree on, what can we do about this together? Can we push the government harder for not just more less restrictions on what to do with the funding that we get from right to buy, but an emergency suspension of right to buy? That would turn the numbers around in one go.
Well, it wouldn't, because you're not increasing the supply of new homes. All you're doing is stopping people fulfill their aspiration to be a homeowner. And it's a far more effective way to be a homeowner than other forms are. So I think we need to do a number of things. Firstly, to make sure that it's meaningful in relation to like-for-like replacement. And that means giving councils more ability to use the receipts from the sale of council homes to build new homes. So that means increasing the supply. I mean, since 1979, when right to buy first began, up until recently, for every 5 homes sold, only 1 was built. And so I accept that we're shrinking the amount of social homes, council homes available. And that's why, since I've become mayor, we've started to increase the numbers of council homes being built. And you've seen the policies in relation to state regeneration. But we really urgently need to increase the numbers of council homes. That's why I continue to lobby the government in relation to the monies they give us. We can use it for those sorts of homes which Londoners need, rather than other sorts of homes that Londoners don't necessarily need as much.
Okay, I'm surprised to hear you back right to buy quite so strongly there. But my second question is about the other major contributor to the losses that are in the data returns, and this is demolitions. They aren't stopping. Your new policies aren't yet coming into effect. Last year, on the ground, the stock returns show 1,700 demolitions last year versus only 946 new builds. So overall, we now have a net loss of council homes last year of 3,600. That's an increase on the previous year. So I've got to raise the alarm that when we get the 2020 Housing Association data through in May, their new builds won't outweigh the lost council homes. We might see an overall net loss in social housing. So my question to you is, what more can we do? What emergency measures can you take to get more social housing into new build projects now to make up for this loss?
Well, firstly, I'm not sure if I accept those figures, but I'm sure that's just a question of dates, not because your figures aren't accurate. The figures I have is the numbers of homes demolished council homes demolished are far less than council homes started. But that's one of the reasons that we've got policies in place now, both the London plan and in relation to funding. So the London plan is quite clear. If councils, for good reasons when it comes to regeneration, may want to demolish a home, they must replace at least a home lost with a new home, but often more. And that's why I refer to density. And secondly, if it's a wish of anybody to receive funding from GLA when it comes to state regeneration, there must be a affirmative ballot of those residents living on an estate before regeneration can take place.
I thought hard to policies, Mr. Mayor. I'm really sorry. I'm running out of my time now. I need to leave some for my colleague. But I'll keep talking to you about this. And if I can send you the data, that would probably clarify things for you as well.
As ever, and I think we're on the same side of the argument here. It's a question of how we get to the ends. But I'm more than happy to work with a member who's very constructive in these issues.
Thank you.
Right. Assembly Member Cooper, you have a question, supplementary question, please.
Yes.
Thank you, Chair. Mr. Mayor, I note that our colleague's figures start from 2003, although she does admit that it is the government's new planning regulations, which are obviously beyond your control, that means that estates are under threat. Now, the estate regeneration ballot policy, which is very popular, is something that she has tried on occasion to take credit for. But of course, Mr. Mayor, you have boosted the number of council rented homes being built since 2016, haven't you? And I just wondered if you could give a proper comparison that will clear up any misapprehensions on her part. Thank you.
Yes, it's really important because the numbers that are being used are numbers that go back to 2003, and even my most vociferous opponents don't blame me for stuff happening in 2003, although I'm sure Sean Bailey might try. And so when I look at homes started by councils, I've got figures that go back to 1990. And for example, from 2008 until 2015, there was zero council homes begun. In 2015-16, there were 700. But in the last few years, we've seen 4,390. The year before that, almost 3,000. So we are increasing to record levels the amount of new council homes begun, but also bringing in new rules before a council wants to demolish a home as well. So the safeguards are there, and I think this is an area where we should be working together with the Green Party, lobbying the government, who appear to be against Londoners who can't afford to have a home in London, get a home in London, and I'd rather we work together to address these issues rather than us not recognising where the real issues are and where the mischief lies.
Well, thank you, Mr. Mayor. And of course, you started from an absolute standing start after your predecessor did so little on social housing, whereas, of course, he inherited from the previous Labour Mayor a pipeline. Thank you very much, Chair. That's very helpful.
Right, Mr. Mayor. Next question is from Assembly Member Dr. Sahota, which is about vaccine rollout.
Thank you, Chair. The vaccine rollout across the country is providing hope and a much-needed light at the end of the tunnel. The rollout of the Pfizer-BioNTech and Oxford-AstraZeneca vaccines is vitally important to protect those at highest risk of infection, hospitalisation and death from COVID-19. It is an incredible scientific achievement that with the Moderna vaccine available from the spring, we will have 3 vaccines in the UK that are proven to be safe and effective in protecting us against this deadly virus. The emergence of the new variant has meant we have to get the virus back under control in London, and I've called for the government to rapidly accelerate the vaccine rollout and ensure at least 2 million people a week are vaccinated nationally. This is the only way to meet the government's target of vaccinating the top 4 prioritisation groups by mid-February, allowing us to rapidly protect our most vulnerable and those who care for them, lift the burden on our NHS and ensure the country can begin to recover. Thanks to the hard work of our brilliant NHS staff, more than 450,000 people in London have received their first dose of the vaccine so far. These numbers are increasing every day and they need to. However, I was concerned that Londoners had initially received only a tenth of the vaccines that have been given across the country. The Minister for Vaccine Deployment, Nadeem Zahawi, has assured me that supply and distribution will increase, and I expect to see a proportionate increase in the number of vaccinations in London this week and next week. We'll of course be monitoring this closely and working to ensure London gets its fair share of the vaccine. We're yet to have a full data on the impact of the vaccine and transmission, and we don't yet know how new strains of COVID-19 will respond to the vaccines. We must remember that the vaccine is not a silver bullet. The new variant of the virus is spreading quickly, and our NHS is under severe pressure right now. The best way for all of us to reduce the rate of the transmission in our communities, protect the NHS, and save lives is to stick to the lockdown restrictions.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor, for that very comprehensive answer. And we know, as you will know, that on the 4th of February we have a plenary session on vaccinations, and hopefully the Minister for Vaccination will take up the invitation to come to the London Assembly, because I know Londoners want to ask a lot of questions of him on behalf of the government, and also to make sure that London gets a fair deal. So hopefully the Mayor will, the Minister will take this up. But you will note that London has the lowest vaccination rate, and that may very well be because we haven't had a proper portion of our supply. But in addition to that, of course, the other risk for us is hesitancy. Particularly as we know that 50% of the BMA community of this country lives in London. What has the Minister been doing to work with local authorities to make sure that we address hesitancy and that we get the message across to communities to make to ensure that the take up of the vaccine is at levels that we need?
Well, I will place in my record my thanks to Nadeem Sahabi in relation to the work he's doing in this area. I've spoken to him now on a number of occasions. He's approachable, he's engaging, he understands the issues, and he really is trying to get on top of this issue of rollout. And I think it's really important that if he can, we appreciate time constraints, he does come to the session, because hopefully he'll be able to reassure you that he appears to have a grip of some of the logistical challenges. This will be the biggest vaccination everyone has taken in our country's history. And so I'm trying my best to work with him collegiately on a cross-party basis. He's been listening to some of the concerns that we expressed to him, and I'm meeting today NHS leaders to see if we've managed to address some of the concerns we highlighted last week. Two big issues. One is the supply of the vaccine. Two is how it's distributed. And I was this week in Brent, Wembley, where a further mass vaccination centre reopened. So it'll be GPs, pharmacies, hospital hubs, mass vaccination centres doing the rollout. But you're spot on in relation to your concern that I've got as well about hesitancy. Those are Londoners who are hesitant about receiving the vaccine, even though they're eligible to do so. And the bad news is, it's those that have suffered most because of this virus who need the vaccine the most, who are the most hesitant. And that's why I'd ask you, Dr. Sahota, as somebody who's respected by your patients and by your local community, to continue to speak up about how vaccines over the course of our history have saved millions of lives, but how this vaccine has gone through a proper, robust regulatory process and is the game changer in relation to saving lives going forward.
Yes, thank you, Mr. Mayor, and also all the work you've done, and I, of course, will continue to work along with you and your office to get this message across. The other, of course, thing is that we are about to open a 24-hour vaccination centres that London tested them out, and as you know, and you will join me in paying credit to all the NHS work staff and how hard they worked, right, and we are going through this crisis because of the way the staff have stretched themselves, their dedication, their commitment, and all the wonderful work they do in the NHS. But having 24 centres will put extra pressure on this NHS staff. Do you think that we can actually staff those centres? Will they be actually contributing towards our vaccination rates?
You raise a really important issue here. I think we've got to recognise that the NHS is a 365, 24 hours a day, 7-day service. Most people working in the NHS already work ridiculous hours. I'm really worried about the increasing number of NHS workers I'm speaking to who are stretched, who are strained, who are really struggling because of the pressures being brought upon them. I have little doubt that many of the NHS workers, particularly in intensive care units, high dependency units, and on the front line, are traumatised. Many may be suffering from post-traumatic stress disorder. We've got to support them. And that's why it's really important. If you're eligible for a vaccine, you take it because it alleviates the pressure on the NHS. You follow the lockdown rules because at least a few people getting the virus. The reason why it's important for the 24-hour, 7 days a week vaccination rollout to happen is because it accelerates the numbers of people receiving the vaccine. We in City Hall have offered to help the government in relation to events expertise, venues, premises, and volunteers who will take some of the pressure of the NHS. In Brent this week, what was really good is how the NHS were training up others to do some of this work. I saw a second-year medical student giving the injections and other practitioners as well. But also we had volunteers doing the signing in, volunteers doing the logging in stuff. So just to reassure you, Anka, it's not just a hard-working NHS having to do even more. They're training others to help out as well, which is really important.
Great. Thank you, Mr. Mayor, for that. Thank you very much. Thank you for everyone who's contributing to the vaccination programme. Thank you.
Thank you. If we have supplementary from Assembly Member Curtin, please.
Yeah, thank you, Chair. Good morning again, Mr. Mayor. Now, you said in that previous answer that you think the vaccines are safe. Well, there's two things wrong with that statement, Mr. Mayor. There's 3 vaccines that what we are being called vaccines that are being used. 2 of those are not vaccines in the sense that most people would understand vaccines. They are experimental mRNA gene technologies that have never been used before on human beings. And we do not know anything about their long-term safety. So how could you say that you know about the safety, particularly for pregnant women and their children and women of childbearing age, when we don't actually know what the effects on those groups of people will be in the long term?
Well, you're wrong. And it's very important I say quite clearly for those watching this that Senator David Curtin is wrong. Let me explain to him why he is wrong. The Independent Medicines and Healthcare Products Regulatory Agency, MHRA, is the UK's regulation body and is globally recognised for requiring the highest standards of safety, quality and effectiveness of any vaccine. They have approved all 3 vaccines, and to get their approval, the vaccine development teams have to share all the data they have, which can be tens of thousands of pages of information. There is no way they can hide anything. There are some groups where the regulators have advised against them receiving the vaccine, for example, those who have allergies. And it's really important, if anybody's concerned, they ask questions of experts rather than scaremongers, COVID deniers and anti-vaxxers.
Okay, well, Mr. Mayor, you can say that I'm wrong, but actually I'm right, because there have been no long-term studies or studies on the long-term effects of these 3 injections which are being given to people, because they haven't existed for more than a few months. So there's absolutely no way that we can know the long-term effects over 5 or 10 years.
I suggest that the member speaks to the bereaved families who've lost their lives because of COVID about the long-term effects of bereavement.
Right, Mr. Mayor, I'm going to move on.
Mr. Mayor, I'm going to move COVID about the long-term effects of suffering
question.
COVID. Well,
Mr. Mayor, you're not answering my question.
We've got to bust some of these myths.
To something else that you said, because you're talking about lockdown as being the only way to get out of this situation and deal with it, when we actually know from the data that countries like Sweden, Brazil and South Korea, who have not imposed draconian lockdowns and have not imposed all the kinds of measures that you are continually calling for, have not cases better. Shouldn't we now actually end the lockdown? Because that's having a devastating effect on businesses, on civil liberties, on children's education and mental health. It's the wrong course of action. The right course of action, which you look at, if you look at the date, would be to use drugs like ivermectin and hydroxychloroquine. Why are you not taking that?
Chair, let me deal with that.
Chair, let me answer the question.
So rather than standing outside St Thomas's Hospital on protesting against...
Mayor, that's nothing to do with me.
Protesting against our hard-working hospital staff, far better for them to speak to the staff inside the hospitals to see what they're treating. And let me do the point about lockdown. The idea that anybody would pray in aid Brazil for a reason not to have lockdown. Let me deal with the facts. The facts are, according to the Scientific Advisory Group for Emergencies, SAGE, who are experts, the lockdown in March 2020 led to a reduction in transmission of approximately 75%, also having a very high impact on reducing COVID deaths and severe disease. Those are the facts.
Well, Mr. Mayor, you haven't answered my question about Sweden.
You're out of your time, Assemblymember Curtin. Let's move on to Assemblymember Cooper on her question on London's economy in 2021.
Thank you, Chair. GLA Economics published the latest version of London's economic outlook on the 7th of December. The central scenario assumed a free trade agreement with the EU, but did not assume an EU national lockdown. A more pessimistic scenario assumed both further restrictions and failure to agree a free trade agreement with the EU. The current best estimate is that the path of the London economy lies between these scenarios, and the output will not recover fully until 2022 or later. The central scenario estimated a gross value added fall of 9.5% in 2020, followed by growth of 6.2% in 2021 and 6.9% in 2022. The lowest scenario estimated a GVA fall of 11.2% in 2020, followed by growth of 3.2% in 2021 and 8.2% in 2022. The lockdown is necessary to protect Londoners and the NHS, but it will inevitably have a negative impact on London's economy, and the trajectory of our ultimate recovery will be significantly affected by how long it lasts. In these hard times, I've called on the government to provide greater financial support to businesses and the self-employed, and with business leaders, we've developed a roadmap for the reopening of London's economy when the time comes.
Thank you very much, Mr. Mayor. Obviously, the combination of the pandemic and lockdowns and Brexit is particularly difficult, and you, in your opening remarks, said that we have effectively a no-deal Brexit for our financial services. I've also now heard very worrying reports that the government is considering taking away some of the hard-won workers' rights now that we've left the EU, including issues around the 48-hour working week. And today, very worrying indications that we may not give proper status to the EU's ambassadorial representation in London. I just wondered if you would like to comment on both of those things, and also how your good work standard might perhaps do something to counteract some of the problems that may arise from watering down of workers' rights. Thank you.
I think you're articulating concerns that many Londoners have in relation to what's called, inverted commas, a race to the bottom. I'm not sure London's future is a sort of Singapore on the Thames, where we deregulate everything to allow us to compete better with our friends in the European Union, who've got far more workers' rights and have got rules and regulations to make sure there's good standards in relation to food, in relation to a whole host of other issues as well. The problem with what we've discovered this week is there was a newspaper story saying the government was considering reducing some of the rights that we'd got through the EU, Workers' Time Directive, one of them. The government denied it, and then lo and behold, we've got confirmation that the new business secretary is reviewing some of these rules. And the problem is, at the same time as we're seeing us going into another recession, we're having a reduction of workers' rights. And that's why Unmesh Desai was right to raise the example of British Gas. And because what we're going to see across our city, if we're not careful, is more and more workers having their rights reduced. And that's not the way to compete with our European Union neighbours. Far better to have high-skilled, well-paid jobs in London and our country as competing rather than the alternative.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. I mean, one of the things that has also come up, certainly we've discussed this in the Economy Committee and talking to representatives from the City of London and London First and London and Partners, is the incredible pressure on London-based businesses, and we really need to support them in light of the pandemic and, of course, in the light of Brexit. What support is City Hall able to give, and also the government able to provide them to deal with the new arrangements, particularly the non-tariff kind of barriers that have just come in at such short notice?
Yeah, another good point. So we're working closely with the business rep groups in London. The Deputy for Business, Rajesh Agrawal, is chairing a subgroup to do with the recovery as well. And the Business Hub is providing new facilities to advise businesses across London in relation to the new red tape placed upon them by this government. I'd rather our Chancellor spend less time on his brand and more time on UK and London, and us being able to compete with with competitors across the globe, rather than him competing with Boris Johnson for the top job in government.
Well, I must say I do agree with that. I want to hear less about Eat Out to Help Out and more about some somewhat more practical measures to help London's businesses. Thank you very much, Mr. Mayor. Thank you, Chair.
We now have supplementary from Assembly Member McCartney.
Thank you, Chair. Mr. Mayor, during this pandemic, the government has been behind the curve on many issues, and as a result, we've seen indecision and a series of U-turns on many essential matters. How has this affected London's ability to counter the effects of the pandemic?
Oh, it's been a nightmare. I mean, it's been a nightmare. You've got no idea, which side of bed the government's going to wake up in, what they're going to announce today. When it comes to lockdowns, when it comes to the social distance rule restrictions, when it comes to what happens over Christmas, when it comes to schools reopening, when it comes to free school meals. I mean, I could go on. And that's not a way to run a government, particularly during a global pandemic, during a crisis. We need to have confidence in the government. One of the reasons people give for the compliance not being as high as it could be is because the public hasn't got confidence in decision makers in the government. You can't have a situation where the most senior advisor in government is driving hundreds of miles to test his eyes. I mean, that doesn't give confidence about people following the rules. And I think what we need is fewer U-turns and the government getting a grip with how to handle this pandemic.
Thank you. Thank you, Chair.
Assembly Member Hall, your supplementary.
Thank you. Well, I will start by saying thank you to the Mayor for supporting the vaccine so robustly, and I would suggest that all Assembly members do. We've already put 5 million jabs into the arms of residents, and we should be very, very proud of that. So on that, Mr. Mayor, thank you. The question was about Brexit, and I know, Mr. Mayor, you constantly find fault with Brexit, but may I remind you that if it were not for Brexit, we would not have all these vaccines. Europe, very sadly, is in a right old mess. I mean, it's fine for you to talk about your boss, Captain Hindsight, about things that the government could have done. They've been in a very difficult position. Having said that, they've ordered all of these vaccines that you and I, Mr. Mayor, both approve of, thank goodness. We cannot find fault in Brexit on the basis we would not have all of these vaccines if we weren't going it on our own. And I applaud the government for having ordered so many and please God getting us out of this wretched pandemic as quickly as possible. And wouldn't you agree that that is the best thing for the businesses in not only London but the whole of the country if we can get ourselves out of this terrible, terrible health situation as soon as possible?
Well, Chair, can I just, I don't mean to be patronising, but this is the way to have, we'll disagree about issues, but the leader of the Tory group was spot on in relation to what she said about vaccines, and I really appreciate what she said and the way she said it, and we should applaud the fact that almost 5 million people across our country have received the jab, and that is brilliant news, and I'm really pleased what you said, the way you said it. Everyone deserves our thanks, the scientists, the volunteers, the NHS and others, and indeed Nadine and others in government who've done a great job, and she's right. In relation to the vaccines being approved, I mean, just to be clear, I don't want there to be any misunderstanding. The government has confirmed that the EU wouldn't have been a roadblock to the British regulatory authority approving the vaccine. So we mustn't give the impression that this wouldn't have happened because they were approved when there were still transitional arrangements in place. So in fact, for all intents and purposes, we were still members of the EU when the regulatory authority approved those 2 vaccines last year. The UN approved this year, Moderna, I accept happened after the end of the transition period, so that's not quite right. In relation to Brexit, it's happened now. Well, I accept it's happened now. The key thing I made in answer to a previous point, Susan, was we should build upon the deal we've got to get a deal with finance, because at the moment, there's no deal with finance. And just to reassure her, the Chancellor agrees with me, and so the Treasury is working on, at the moment it's a memorandum of understanding, and we're trying to say to the Treasury that actually needs to be a bit more. It's the building blocks for further deals and stuff. And I think it's really important, in finance in particular, we have a good trade deal with the European Union.
Okay, I accept some of what you've just said there, Mr. Mayor. If you have time today, look at the Financial Times. There's some really good articles in there about how our financial sector is actually employing more and more people. I was really positive when I read that this morning. I'll leave it there. Thank you both. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. We have a question from Assembly Member Prince on Oyster auto top-up.
Thank you, Chair. The current minimum auto top-up amount of £20 was set for technical reasons. It ensures customers will always have sufficient credit to cover some of the longer distance journeys possible on the network covered by Oyster, such as from Reading or Gatwick, and to reduce the risk of customers not paying the correct fare. However, I can see that some customers might benefit from being able to top up less each time. I know TfL was recently contacted by London Travel Watch on this issue and will be meeting them to explore this further. As the Assembly member is aware, TfL has recently decided not to proceed at this time with its proposals to temporarily remove cash payments at those stations that are still accepting them. While the coronavirus transmission rate is high and passenger numbers remain low, TfL will maintain the temporary cashless arrangements already in place at ticket machines at other LU and DLR stations and at London Overground and TfL rail ticket offices, as these arrangements are generally working well. The decisions to pause wider rollout follows engagement throughout November and December, and I want to thank everyone, including Assembly members, for their insights and questions which have helped TfL further understand how their proposals might affect people, especially in the current context. TfL will keep under review what the appropriate payment options should be in the network as the way people pay for their travel continues to change. This may include looking again at the role of cash payments in the future, as there's been a significant reduction in the number of people using cash over the years. The feedback TfL got from this exercise will help shape any future proposals. TfL will continue to monitor the situation, respond to any concerns raised, and keep stakeholders updated on any further changes.
You're muted. Assemblymember Prince, unmute your microphone.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. That's very helpful. It was following a discussion with Travel Watch. They asked me to raise the question, and so credit to them. Credit to you and the team for recognising there are limitations on where you can go cashless, although I understand the reasons for wanting to go cashless. But I would just re-emphasise, at this moment in time, if there is not the technological barrier that there was previously on the amount of top-up, if you could reduce it to £10, that would really help and probably would encourage even more people to take that route in using the Oyster card.
Yeah, I mean, Chair, just to reassure the member, London Travel Watch, I've seen the letter they wrote to the Commissioner. They make some really good points in their letter. I'm sure they've shared it with you as well. TfL are planning some changes to the way auto top-up works. And just to give you the reassurance I'm sure you're looking for, they're exploring the feasibility of a new £10 top-up option as part of this. Chair, why don't I agree to keep the member in the loop, and why don't I keep all of the Assembly in the loop, because other members I'm sure will be keen to get progress on this.
Thank you.
Right. Can we move on to the next question, which is from Assemblymember Boff with regards to TfL station car park projects?
Well, thank you, Chair. London has a housing crisis. Quite simply, there are not enough homes. As the Assemblymember knows, the only way to fix this is to build more genuinely affordable homes. There is no good reason for TfL to reduce or change its property development programme. TfL is one of the capital's largest landowners, and it must continue to transform its surplus land into the new homes that London desperately needs, while also delivering a vital long-term income stream that can be reinvested into the transport network. My job is to make sure these homes are well designed, built in sustainable locations, and most importantly, meet Londoners' needs. Since 2017, TfL and its partners have already started building almost 1,500 homes, with over 5,500 more having planning approval and planning applications for a further 2,000 having been submitted. 50% of these homes will be genuinely affordable. The government wants us to look creatively at new income streams. In fact, that's a condition of TfL's emergency funding, and this is one of the programmes that's meeting this goal. Every site in TfL's portfolio goes through a rigorous feasibility exercise to determine if the location is suitable and to assess what could be delivered. My London plan sets out that underused brownfield sites, such as car parks, that should be considered for development. TfL's car parks are no longer used in the way they were when first introduced. Public transport then wasn't as affordable, frequent, safe and accessible as it is today, with bus routes and cycling facilities providing alternative ways to reach these stations. At Cockfosters, for example, 96% of people driving to the station are within walking distance of alternative public transport options. We also have an urgent need to tackle inactivity and poor air quality, which can help to address by encouraging people to travel differently to our stations. Of course, accessibility for all is vital, and TfL will retain or re-provide blue badge parking spaces for those that need to park at stations. By transforming underused car parks, TfL is encouraging more sustainable travel while helping to solve London's housing crisis.
Assemblymember Boff.
As chair of TfL, what lessons will you learn from the unanimous rejection by Enfield Planning Committee of your high-rise planning application to build on Arnos Grove Station car park, and the cross-party rejection last night by Harrow Planning Committee of your application at Cannons Park?
Well, Chair, as the member will know, I can't comment on live applications. They're quasi-judicial. He'll be aware there is a role for the mayor or deputy mayor where there's a conflict to either call in an application, and so I can't speak on those specific cases. I can speak generally if he wants me to do so, but he'll appreciate why I can't speak on those cases.
Well, if you've called them in, that's the case. Have you called them in?
As I'm speaking, I've not called either of those in.
So you can talk about them because they're not live. They've actually been concluded as far as the planning committee is concerned. And until you actually call them in, you can talk about them.
No, I can't, Chair. I'm really happy for him to take the same advice I've received. I can't talk about them, and I won't talk about them.
You choose not to talk about them, and we understand why. Your Arnos Grove application included just 14 family homes out of 162, which is 9%. Overall, your 5 most recent applications have just 135 family-sized homes, 12% of the total. Shouldn't you be using these schemes as an opportunity to support and create local communities rather than just warehousing people?
Well, Chair, I'm not speaking about that particular application, so it's really important I'll put that on record in case somebody's watching this and thinks I've formed a view. In relation to family houses in general, we're really keen to have more family homes that are affordable to Londoners. Market value family homes aren't affordable to most Londoners. I don't subscribe to the view, for example, that homeless Londoners can afford a £5,000 deposit for a home. So what we're seeking to do is to encourage the government to give us more financial support for subsidised family homes. At the moment, the funding the government gives us are more skewered towards shared ownership in relation to home ownership in relation to smaller units. The reason why that can be an advantage is when it comes to adult overcrowding in homes. We have many examples of one of the reasons for overcrowding in homes is because adult children can't afford to purchase subsidised smaller units of home, 1 or 2 bedrooms. By us having more subsidised 1 or 2 bedroom homes, it means they can leave those homes that are overcrowded, which makes those homes less overcrowded. But as and when the government changes its funding formula, so it's skewed more towards subsidised low market family homes, of course we'd like to do so if it's possible. But there's no point building family homes that only very few people can afford to buy, or landlords buy to then sublet to people to rent.
Mr. Mayor, they're expensive because nobody's building them, and you're continuing the trend. Will your keenness to support family housing at some point be represented in the figures? Because since you've been mayor, the number of family-sized homes has declined drastically.
What the member clearly doesn't understand, this is one of the reasons why many of us weren't surprised that the Tories think homeless people can afford £5,000 deposits, is how out of touch they are. The average cost of a family home in London is north of £500 million, it's £500,000. Now, he may be able to afford those sorts of family homes, but the vast majority of Londoners can't. So unless we're able to provide...
You're talking about the purchased market, Mr. Mayor. Social housing is the same. They just aren't the family side. Anyway, thank you, Chair. Thank you, Chair. You're saying the same old stuff.
Chair, I've been asked a question. I'm not sure why he's scared of the answer.
Yeah,
I'm not. No.
Where
Member Bob,
the answers they don't like, they don't want to hear them.
Member Bob, look, you're making various comments. Allow Mr. Mayor to respond to the comments that you're making. You may not like them, but
Chair,
show courtesy.
It works like this. It works like this, Chair. I ask a question.
No, it doesn't.
Should ask a question.
Let me stop here, please.
Let's not continue the agony, shall we?
Can you stop here, please? Assembly Member, sorry, Mr. Mayor.
Chair, can I just say, the member may try and patronise the chair, but I listen to the directions of the chair. And as you've asked me to respond to the question from the member, let me respond. The fact is that the way the formula works from the government is it's skewered towards the 1-bedroom, 2-bedroom properties in the market in London, but also it's skewered against subsidised family homes. I've seen, by the way, what the previous mayor was doing in relation to affordable homes. He had 2 definitions of an affordable home. One costing £450,000 to buy, or one costing 80% of market value to rent. I'm not in favour of building luxury penthouse flats for foreigners to invest in. Nothing against foreigners. I'm in favour of building homes for Londoners. He may not like that, but that's what Londoners voted for in 2016. And over the course of the next 100 days, I'll be explaining to Londoners why the only way to get more affordable homes for Londoners is by voting for me on May the 6th rather than the Tory candidate.
Perhaps, Mr. Mayor, you could send me a letter, which I'll circulate to other Assembly members, asking how many penthouses you have built. But thank you very much for that. I don't require an answer. We'll get that in the letter. Thank you very much, Chair.
Let me respond to that. Well, Chair, I'm not going to respond to him in writing because this is Mayor's question time. And if he wants to ask me a question for me to respond to now, I'll respond to. He may not like the answer, but that's my prerogative to answer the question. So, Chair, let me ask him, would you like me to answer your question now?
No, I want a letter.
Here we go. Do you see?
All right.
Letter. I want you on the record.
Let's stop here. The mayor has refused to give you a letter. He was happy to answer your question. Let's move on. We have a supplementary from Assemblymember Dr. Moore.
Thank you very much, Chair. And I think we'd all agree, nobody who's been on this assembly or as a councillor would disagree with the fact there is a real and clear need for genuinely affordable housing, particularly for families, though not only for families in London. And I think we're all very grateful that one of the first things you did as Mayor was to scrap that definition of affordable housing being 80% of market rate that Boris Johnson brought in when he was Mayor. But if the government changed their rules around affordable housing and made it genuinely affordable and provided TfL with the appropriate finances needed to deal with the pandemic, would TfL need to rely on maximising these long-term revenue streams so much?
It's a really good point. I mean, there are a number of models out there. So one way to raise revenues is to sell off surplus land, and you get some money in, but it's gone then. It's like selling off the crown jewels, and it's a one-off sale. So what I'd rather do, which makes economic sense, but also means we can get the homes Londoners need, is to keep the asset, to work with a developer partner, to have a proportion of affordable homes, 50% genuinely affordable homes, and the other half market value. And that means you have a revenue stream coming in basically in perpetuity that helps TfL going forward, but also you have some additional monies in because of the market value sales as well. That's the sensible way to proceed in relation to the economics of TfL, but also what London's needs are. There's going to be more and more pressure on TfL because of the way it's funded by the government, or should I say not funded. And that's why we've got to make sure that we continue to use all surplus lands in a sensible way financially, but also as to what London's needs are.
Thank you, and it's very much about the right scheme in the right place.
Absolutely.
Okay, we move on to the next question, which is on action on the cladding and fire safety scandal from Assemblymember Pigeon.
Thank you, Chair. Can I thank the member for raising this really important issue? I've always supported leaseholders and residents impacted by the building safety scandal in London, and I remain deeply concerned about the impact this may be having on their safety, their personal finances, and their mental health and well-being. I've consistently lobbied the government on this point, and in December, I proposed that they introduce a groundbreaking levy on major private property developers that could raise £3 billion to address the rampant inequality in building safety standards and fund vital cladding replacement work on properties across London. This proposal was supported by many cladding groups and by my Deputy Mayor, who also raised this with the Minister directly. In September, I also wrote to the government outlining 5 urgent steps to unlock the EWS1 crisis for the many thousands of leaseholders trapped in unsellable and potentially unsafe homes. I haven't received a reply, and I've chased this up. In response to pre-legislative scrutiny on the Building Safety Bill, I called for protections for leaseholders from the cost of historic defects, and I've been pushing for funding to cover the cost of interim safety measures such as waking watches. As well as lobbying the government, where I have powers to act, I've ensured we are doing everything we can. My New London plan takes groundbreaking steps to introduce fire safety into the planning system, ensuring that safety is considered from the very beginning. New homes on public land commissioned via my development panel are now required to meet higher standards than those set out in building regulations. This includes a requirement for sprinklers in all purpose-built blocks of flats and a complete ban on combustible materials on all buildings, regardless of height. The same requirements have also been introduced for social landlords wishing to bid for funding from my new Affordable Homes programme. I'm afraid the government continues to fail to realise the scale of the building safety crisis. Their response has been slow, piecemeal and simply not good enough. I'm astounded that over 3.5 years since the awful fire at Grenfell, there is still no sign of a long-term and fair solution to the building safety crisis. These leaseholders and residents deserve better.
Thank you very much, Mr. Mayor. We agree that government measures to tackle the cladding and fire safety scandal have not only been perilously slow, continue to be wholly insufficient, leaving thousands of Londoners living in dangerous buildings and many leaseholders facing financial ruin. Well, I fully support and encourage the building of new affordable homes in our city, and I've heard your answer today. We continue to see some housing providers that you fund recording strong profits, yet failing to protect and safeguard tenants and leaseholders in their buildings against serious fire safety defects and dangerous cladding. So I'm wondering, will you make it a condition of future GLA funding that housing providers must demonstrate to you that they've explored all possible funding options for remediation, with the exception of charging leaseholders, and show that they've implemented and funded all necessary interim safety measures for any affected buildings they own?
Can I thank the member for raising this really important issue and the way she's raised it? So we speak on a regular basis with our partners to address these issues. Just so she's aware, one of the challenges they have is with finite resources. They're really keen to build new affordable homes, but they've got to deal with a backlog of remediation that you refer to, rightly so. And that's one of the reasons why we continue to lobby the government in relation to both remediation, but also new affordable homes. The challenge that the housing associations have is they've got really acute pressures in relation to construction of new homes, additional obligations in new homes at the same time as the backlog. And that's why we continue to engage with them. We continue to want additional resources for them to remediate, because as she said, what nobody wants is for leaseholders aren't rich people, to have to pay for the remediation, which, by the way, they bought in good faith and nobody pointed out to them when they bought.
Absolutely, but I think it could be something you could look at to assure yourself that those people you're giving money to have put in as many measures as they can. But I was also shocked to learn that under current legislation, leaseholders have no legal right to see the fire risk assessment for the building in which they live. So will you consider trialling a public register of fire risk assessments in London so would-be renters and owners can check the fire safety status of their potential new home, such as the one that's used to register domestic energy performance certificates?
So the Building Safety was currently going through Parliament, and we're speaking to legislators about tweaks and changes there. That's one of the ideas that we're discussing with them. I'm really happy to report back once we've had those discussions. My concern is also the obligations on the firefighters to do the inspections. One of the problems in London is we've got more than twice as many of these buildings than the rest of the country put together, but also it's quite difficult to work out who the owners are. It's difficult position in place. So there's those who manage the building, those who own the building, but I'm more than happy to look at this issue in relation to whether the Building Safety Bill is the way to force owners to give this information, because often there's an obligation on them to do so.
Lovely, thank you very much. A lot of attention is rightly on high-rise buildings, but we know it's also a serious issue in low-rise blocks, and of course buildings under 18 metres can't access some of these funds, leaving thousands of leaseholders without any route to financial support. I'm wondering what work you've been doing, Mr. Mayor, to really push for those living in buildings under 18 metres high.
Well, she knows the Sutton very well. There's an awful fire in Sutton, which is below 5 stories, and some of my boff knows too well the awful fire in Barkingside, which is not a tall building as well. And so we are working with not just the building owners and the building managers, but the local councils in relation to what they can do, speaking to many of these private owners about remediating some of this combustible cladding. That's not ACM. These aren't 8-metre buildings. That leads the fire service to think that the built environment isn't what it should be. And just so she's aware, one of the challenges our fire service have is they can't now say stay put, because they're not sure whether that building is safe enough for them to stay put.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor.
It's a real problem, and we're taking steps to address this issue.
Thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you. We now have questions from Assembly Member Desai, which is about police implications of leaving the EU. Mr. Mayor.
Thank you very much, Chair, and thank you to the member for this really important question. There is no doubt that the newly agreed Brexit deal does not come close to the benefits we enjoyed as members of the EU, and whichever way you slice it, the deal falls short of what's best for London. The MPS will continue to work with European counterparts on security and policing under the new agreement, but they no longer have the same EU tools and powers as before. National Police Chiefs Council Chair Martin Hewitt said that, and I quote, "The fallback systems will be slower, provide less visibility of information and intelligence, and make joined-up working with European partners more cumbersome." The UK has forfeited the use of the European arrest warrant, the Schengen information system, and its membership of Europol and Eurojust, making it harder to keep track of terrorists, criminals, and serious organised criminal networks. Instead, the UK have become a third-party partner with Europol and Eurojust, similar to the relationship with the United States. The police are now using alternative, inferior arrangements, but these are not like-for-like replacements of EU tools and powers. In most cases, they are slower and less efficient, and they present a drop-off in capability for tackling cross-border criminality. The loss of the Schengen information system will have a major operational impact, according to the NPCC. This database was aligned to European systems, and whilst the police are prepared to use Interpol in its place, this requires a more manual and slower process, with forces circulating information on far fewer persons and objects of interest. That being said, I believe the historic bonds between London and the European agencies will endure. The Met has good relations and will continue to work together with our European friends on the many challenges we face, including the fight against terrorism.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor, for that answer. Mr. Mayor, the Home Secretary, in an article in the Sunday Telegraph, has stated that she feels the UK will be safer following exit from the EU, as UK police will be able to benefit from, quote, stronger powers as a result of the deal. Do you agree with these comments, especially in light of what you said? What are these stronger powers? Have you or the Met been given an indication of what impact these so-called stronger powers will have for policing in London?
No, it's nonsense. It's just lies. It's lies. There are no stronger powers. And we discovered this week. We discovered this week that we've left the EU, but the Home Secretary still hasn't got control over our borders. They can't even sort out the borders in relation to the virus, let alone additional powers to fight terrorism and organised crime. We had a former Commissioner, Ian Blair, talking on the radio recently, explaining his concern about, for example, terrorists he was able to bring back speedily in 2005 can't now be brought back because we've left the European Union and have no access to the European arrest warrant.
Mr. Mayor, I'm very conscious of my time, but I'm going to ask you this one and final question. The Home Office has managed to accidentally delete around 400,000 fingerprints, DNA, and arrest records from the police national computer. What has also been less reported is the Home Office, as a result of the Brexit deal, have been required to delete 40,000 alerts relating to European criminals. What impact could the loss of these records have on London?
A huge impact, because it means that police officers haven't got up-to-date information on potentially dangerous people. And that's why we've got to be honest about what Brexit means. I mean, some people try and sugarcoat how bad it is. This is a live, real example of the consequences of us leaving the EU.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor.
Thank you. Next question is from Assembly Member McCartney, and that's support for the 3 million excluded.
I'm appalled that despite the clear evidence that so many are being denied the support they need through the pandemic, leaving many in or at risk of severe financial hardship, the government continues to ignore the millions excluded. This further current national lockdown will make matters even worse. The government must now listen to what Excluded UK, myself and London's business groups have said. It's not too late for the government to do the right thing. The government has not put in place support for the newly self-employed, directors of limited companies, or those who have annual trading profits in excess of £50,000. GLO figures show that hundreds of thousands of self-employed people in London could be excluded from the financial help they need. Many of those affected are not well off. They're self-employed freelancers and tradespeople across all sectors of our economy. They will be supporting families with mortgages, rent, and other essential costs. And we can't forget or ignore the impact this is having on people's mental health. People are in real financial despair. I've been listening to the concerns of the self-employed, and I continue to press the government to fix this. In November, I stood with 7 other city region mayors, Excluded UK, and self-employed people to call for action. In December, I wrote to the Chancellor to call for targeted financial support to the taxi and private hire vehicle. Even with limited funds, I continue to provide whatever direct support I can for the self-employed, including the Pay It Forward platform, Back to Business grants, Culture at Risk Fund, and Creative Economy Growth Programme. The London Business Hub and My Employment Rights Hub are updated frequently with help and signposting. We're also funding research by Centre for London to make recommendations on supporting the self-employed. Now, the government must urgently review the support for the self-employed, or we risk more businesses in London which were thriving until recently being lost for good.
Thank you for that answer, Mr. Mayor. Many of my constituents in Enfield and Haringey are amongst those workers who have received no support from the government. We are now in another lengthy lockdown, and by the end of this lockdown, that will be almost a year without any support. And you're quite right, there is great financial hardship. They feel ignored and let down by this government. Many of them are freelancers working in the creative industries, which is so important to London's economy. What should the government be doing as a priority for these workers?
I think the government needs to recognise that hundreds of thousands in London, millions across the country have fallen through the cracks. They've received no assistance, like you say, since last March. We estimate that over 60% of creative freelancers have lost all work. Equity estimate that 40% of their members have not been able to access support. And that's why it's so important that the government steps in to help these creative people who contribute hugely towards our economy in good times through the bad times, or we could lose them forever, not just from these industries, but also from London. And that's why I'm imploring the Chancellor to do right by them in his forthcoming budget, preferably in advance of that, because they can't wait until March.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. And will you promise to continue to speak up for these workers? And could you just let me know a little bit more about the help that you've given as far as you're able to support those workers who have been excluded from government support?
Yeah, we continue with limited funds that we can to help. You know, in relative terms, you know, a fraction of the money the government's got, we're doing much more, which just doesn't seem right. Whether it's the Pay It Forward scheme, the Culture at Risk Fund, we've got a new business hub doing an amazing amount of really good work. The Back to Business financial support we're giving, the grant scheme we're giving. I recently announced an additional £5.5 million towards the recovery. It's really important, though, that the government steps in to help. I was on a call yesterday with business leaders and business people, and some of their stories are heartbreaking, and the further national lockdown has compounded some of the challenges they faced last year. And these last-minute U-turns from the government means they can't even plan for the future, which doesn't make sense either.
Yep. Thank you, Mr. Mayor, and good luck in your lobbying efforts. Thank you, Chair.
Right. Next question is from Assembly Member Devenish. For you, Mr. Mayor, it's on electric buses.
Thank you. London now has the biggest zero-emission bus fleet in the UK and one of the largest in Europe. I want London's bus fleet to become entirely zero-emission as quickly as possible. The scale of the challenge is many times larger in London than Coventry or Oxford, each operating hundreds of buses compared to our 9,000. TfL has already made great strides since I became mayor in bringing over 400 zero-emission buses into service. This is expected to rise to 700 by the end of this year and 2,000 by 2025, dependent upon TfL reaching an adequate financial settlement with the government. Since I became mayor, we've made huge progress, and now all buses in TfL's 9,000-strong core fleet meet or exceed stringent Euro 6 emission standards. This important milestone has been achieved in less than 4 years. Air quality and carbon emissions will be further improved by moving towards a zero-emission bus network. That's why the financial sustainability plan that TfL has submitted to government is clear about the scale of investment needed to deliver this as soon as possible. This is critical to meeting my zero carbon target by 2030. Decarbonising the transport network and cleaning up London's air will also support green jobs in the bus industry across the UK. Around £85 million has been invested in retrofitting older diesel buses to meet or exceed the Euro 6 emission standard since 2017. Each retrofitted bus emits up to 95% less NOx and 80% less particulate matter than before, leading to significant air quality improvements across London. 12 low-emission bus zones were delivered between 2017 and 2019 to tackle the worst air quality hotspots outside central London. The zones have helped transform local air quality. Both Coventry and Oxford will receive funding from the government to replace its entire fleet of buses with all electric versions, to install new infrastructure such as charging systems and pay for electric grid updates. TfL has outlined to the government that with steady financial support, it could make all buses in London zero emission by 2030.
Good morning, Mr. Mayor.
Good morning.
Mr. Mayor, Coventry, as you've said, the city of Coventry has overtaken our global city of London by 12 years in its ambition to have an electric bus fleet. As the son of a bus driver, aren't you embarrassed by the poverty of your green ambition?
God, who writes this stuff? Look, Coventry is receiving 100% funding, 100% from the government. 100% from the government. So the government's written a £50 million cheque to Coventry, a separate £50 million cheque to Oxford, and is not giving us anywhere near the support we need. We have more electric buses in London than any city in Europe. Began after I became mayor. We're not wasting money on vanity route masters. £326 million on 800 route masters. We've retrofitted all of our 9,000 buses and have an ambition to go fully electric as soon as possible. If he was more successful in persuading his mates in the government to give us more support rather than being anti-London, we could get there sooner rather than later.
Well, you could be a collegiate mayor, Mr. Mayor, and maybe we're to work together to achieve this, because this is something you've made little progress on. You were mayor for 3.5 years before COVID. You've done, as usual, not a lot. I'll leave it there because of time.
Chair, I'm really happy for the member to let me know how many electric buses did I inherit?
Yes.
How many hydrogen-powered buses did I inherit?
I think it's a mayoral question time, actually, Mr. Mayor. Your record is appalling, and you can try and hide behind it. Thank you, Chairman.
We have the most electric buses of any city in the country and in Europe. We've had a massive rollout over the last 4.5 years. If we had a less anti-London government...
He's obviously very concerned about his appalling record, Chairman, because he can't stop. Actually, get on with the job, Mr. Mayor, would be wonderful. Have a great day.
Sorry, I heard the shouting, but I didn't hear a question, Chair.
There wasn't one, so let's get a real question, which is from Assembly Member Dr. Moore. The extraordinary funding and financial agreement for Transport for London. Thank you,
Chair. Before the pandemic, TfL was close to achieving a level of financial sustainability unheard of among transport authorities around the world. But COVID has led to the lowest tube ridership since the 19th century and has decimated TfL's finances, revealing that a funding model that is so reliant on fare revenues is not sustainable. 72% of TfL's operating income comes from passenger revenue, far more than any other major city. London contributes around 23% of the UK's total GDP, and in 2018, London contributed £39 billion in net to the Treasury. As part of the most recent funding agreement, TfL was required to produce a plan setting out how it could become financially sustainable by 2023-2024. A copy of this report was shared with the government and the Assembly last week. It provides the starting point for discussions with government ahead of the current funding agreement expiring in March. TfL is seeking government support to drive a green recovery, focused on maintaining service levels and decarbonising transport by 2030, while still achieving a level of financial sustainability greater than many other mass transit systems. TfL has already explained that around £3 billion in support will be needed in 2021-2022 to make up for income lost due to the pandemic. Although future demand remains unclear, London will certainly need support into the long term for investment in the city's transport infrastructure. The funding model must be revised to ensure TfL can provide the services we need. The £1.6 billion annual funding for capital investment that TfL is requesting from 2023 onwards would be used to support London's recovery from the pandemic by making London's buses zero emission, improving the safety and efficiency of our roads, and encouraging active travel.
Thank you very much, Mr. Mayor. And I'd like to follow up with a couple of questions, though I will start by saying, contrary to the somewhat shouty and inaccurate assertions by Assemblymember Devenish, you earlier this morning welcomed cross-party approach on the issue of vehicle excise duty. Has the government responded to your proposals to play fair with Londoners by allowing TfL to keep the £500 million a year in vehicle excise duty Londoners pay every year?
Well, the discussions have just begun. I don't like giving running commentaries on negotiations, but we'll be able to see how effective having Tory members of the Assembly are in relation to the response from the government. I really welcome Keith Prince's offer to work on a cross-party basis, persuading the government to allow London to keep the vehicle excise duty raised in London. We'll see now what response the government has to this cross-party approach from the GLA.
Thank you very much, and I hope they will listen to that. I mean, what are the next steps of the independent review? Will you be formally responding to all the suggestions made? And if so, what's the time frame for that to happen?
Yeah, in due course, we'll be responding to the independent review, and just make the point that we published both the London Sustainability Plan, because we believe in transparency, and we published the independent review conducted by experts for no cost at all. The government, on the other hand, have paid for, using taxpayers' money, a report done by KPMG, and it's locked in a safe somewhere. We can't get to see it. And so, yeah, we'll respond in due course, and we're using that as the base source for discussions with the government over the course of the next few days and weeks.
Yeah, well, that begs a final question from me then. You mentioned the KPMG review, and the government, as I understand it, has refused to share that KPMG review into TfL finances. How difficult is it to negotiate a funding agreement with the government when they are guided by a report that you haven't seen and therefore can't respond to, or indeed take fully into account in your submission?
Well, it's unheard of. Nobody can give me an example where anybody's working under these conditions. And one of the things that I'll be doing, let me just make this loud and clear, over the next 100 days, is letting Londoners know what sort of government we have. That they will use taxpayers' money to prepare a report in relation to TfL, which includes a commentary on how TfL is doing, but also has ideas on going forward, but refuses to share that document with TfL, not only the mayor, who's chair of TfL, but the commissioner or any of his staff. And the version they give them has large chunks blacked out and redacted. It beggars belief.
Really not playing fair. Thank you very much, Mr. Mayor.
Okay, a question from Assembly Member Qureshi, and that's on rough sleeping in the second wave during winter. Mr. Mayor.
Thank you, Chair. Can I thank the member for this really important issue at this time of year? In partnership with boroughs, charities and the NHS, I'm continuing to do all I can to keep rough sleepers safe during the pandemic. It's essential that we're able to sustain our achievements so far. Since March, accommodating well over 6,000 people, including almost 2,200 in GLA-procured hotels, avoiding an estimated 7,000 infections and 90 deaths, as well as 390 hospital and 115 ICU admissions. The extent of the second wave, the further lockdown, the new variant, the onset of winter have made our task more challenging and more important, and we're doing all that we can. Across London, over 3,200 rough sleepers are currently being safely accommodated. Around 690 of these are in 6 GLA-procured hotels, 2 of which we opened this winter. We've also reopened our COVID isolation beds, and in addition, are taking referral of people being discharged from hospitals, freeing up much-needed NHS beds. With GLA support, the faith and community sector has done amazing work to provide an alternative to the usual 800 spaces in communal winter night shelters, securing COVID-safe accommodation for over 270 rough sleepers. My team has also worked with the boroughs to make sure there is COVID-safe provision during severe weather, including up to 80 beds in a new GLA-procured facility. Since last summer, London boroughs and I have been repeatedly urging the government to provide the additional funding needed to safely accommodate everyone on the street over the winter, estimated at £24 million in London. The response from the government has been both piecemeal and inadequate. £25 million nationally announced in October, and a further £10 million nationally announced this month. The government has continued to resist our calls to fund a comprehensive second Everyone In, perhaps because, unlike during the first wave, Dame Louise Casey is no longer there to spearhead a compassionate and life-saving approach. With the second wave even worse than the first, I can see no justification for this. Without it, I very much fear that much of the good work achieved so far will be undone, and that London's rough sleepers will face the bleakest of winters.
Well, thank you, Mr. Mayor, for that comprehensive update at this time of year. As you said, it's critical critical time of the year, and you've had to twice get things into operation because of how cold it is. One of the things you didn't quite give us information is how much of the extra 10 million that the government has suggested is London getting at all?
We're getting a portion of that. I've not got the exact figure here, but I can write to in relation to that.
Right.
But the £35 million is national, 10 million plus the 25. Just for London, we need £24 million, and you'll be aware that in previous schemes we've got a fraction of the amount we need.
Okay, I'll follow that up after the meeting. And how many people do you think have been left sleeping rough due to the government not stepping up to giving London the funding it needs?
We worry there are hundreds of people out in London that shouldn't be there. One of the downsides of the many upsides of there being few people on the streets because of the lockdown is they can't let StreetLink know who is rough sleeping. What normally happens, as you're aware, is the StreetLink app is used to let the charities know where people are sleeping rough, so we can send out outreach workers to help them. Because people are out and about, they're not letting us know using StreetLink, but there are still many, many hundreds out and about sleeping rough in London. Outreach workers are going out, notwithstanding the pandemic. The issue is there are fewer places, because what we don't want is people to be in places that aren't COVID secure, because obviously the virus spreads quickly, and that's why we need to get them off the streets as soon as possible and keep them in once they're in. Yes,
and there's no doubt along the edge of the road where I jog, there are increasing levels of rough sleepers, and it's quite clear the circumstances as you've explained. Can I just now move to private renters, if you don't mind, in this question? The National Residential Landlords Association said ministers were doing more harm than good, and repeatedly banning repossessions, as this simply stacks up more tenant debt on top of their existing arrears. You have called on the government to put in place a support package that would include providing grants to support renters to clear their rent arrears and remain in their homes. Do you expect the government to take such measures in the future?
No renter who has lost income due to coronavirus will be forced out of their home, nor will any landlord face unmanageable debts. Not my words, the words of the Housing Secretary in March. An example of a promise made and a promise broken. I'm afraid the bad news is we're seeing tenants still leaving their homes because of arrears. Although there's been a winter truce on bailiff actions, we're still seeing court orders made. The government should be supporting landlords who need the monies, but also supporting tenants as well. And it's really important the government understands that they're creating problems for both tenants and landlords.
Well, thank you for that response. I hope private renters and rough sleepers realise on whose side you're on these matters. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
Right. The next question, number 0044, we're not able to take up as they're out of time. So we move on to question from Assembly Member Dismore. She's about Waking Watch Relief Fund. Mr. Mayor.
Since the horrific tragedy at Grenfell Tower, time and again, the government's response has been too little too late. I'm deeply disappointed to see that the latest fund announced by the government does not go far enough. Average costs of a Waking Watch in London at an eye-watering £256 per household per month are double the average for the rest of the country. Some households are paying as much as £500 per month on top of astronomical insurance bills. The Waking Watch Relief Fund is a belated step in the right direction, but it's not enough to fund all affected buildings. It fails to reimburse leaseholders who have already paid out for interim Waking Watch costs, and it doesn't consider those who continue to need a Waking Watch as well as a fire alarm. And yet again, it fails to address buildings under 18 metres. It took the government too long to ban combustible materials in new buildings, and we're still waiting for their belated extension of the ban to buildings below 18 metres to take effect. Time and again, the government solutions come up short. I'll continue, with the support of at least some members of the Assembly, to press for change.
Thank you for that reply. Would you agree that the Conservative government's announcement is a fake news shabby conflict because it gives no help whatsoever with the cost of waking watches? Leaseholders have been left in limbo, facing demands of hundreds of pounds a month. And in fact, the figures we had from FREP was that the average cost of waking watch is £499 a month. The Local Government Association recently reported that they're now being pressurised by government to use trading standards departments to change the price of waking watches. but they've got no powers under which they can do so. It's the case, isn't it, that the Secretary of State is giving beleaguered leaseholders empty promises, unsupported by entirely insufficient funding, dodging his responsibility by expecting cash-strapped London boroughs to step in where they've got no jurisdiction.
Spot on. You know, this is a good example of the government passing the buck without the resources. And so I'm sure he's spoken to, as I have, heartbroken leaseholders who simply can't afford anymore to pay for the Waking Watch, but they have to. They're taking on debt to pay for the Waking Watch. Many of them aren't just suffering financial hardship, but mental anguish. I've spoken to people, Andrew, and I'm sure you have, who are suicidal. And although the government's offering to pay for fire alarms to be installed 3.5 years after Grenfell, some leaseholders require a Waking Watch and a fire alarm. But there's also no reimbursement for the money spent in the past. And there's no way at all that councils can step in. They're starved of resources as it is.
And that's right. London Fire Brigade has met the challenge of London's built environment by stepping up their inspections of buildings at risk, including monitoring the performance of Waking Watches, so as to ensure that Londoners are as safe as can be achieved in these difficult circumstances. What's been the impact on London Fire Brigade's finances and operational capacity of these extra demands, especially at the time of COVID? And is it fair that the government have refused to address the funding pressures this additional workload has created?
Yeah, there's a number of things happening to the London Fire Brigade. One is we don't receive the right level of funding from the government that the fire service requires as a global city. Two, additional obligations placed on the fire service because of Grenfell Tower and the built environment. And three, even further obligation on the fire service because of the inspection regime, which he talked about. And so the Commissioner's got this invidious job of transforming the fire service for the reasons we've rehearsed before at a time of limited resources. That's one of the reasons I don't apologise for having to increase that part of the council tax to pay for the fire service additional obligations upon them. It still doesn't go far enough, and the fire service also having to make savings because we've lost business rates and council tax because of the COVID pandemic as well.
Yeah, it's a difficult position for the fire brigade. And can I just go back to the levy you mentioned earlier on? You recently called for a levy on house builders to fund remediation works on homes affected by dangerous cladding. And I should say also, it's not just cladding, but there are other problems with the built environment as well, which Andy Rowe, the Commissioner, has identified. What's been the government's response to this proposal so far, if any? And would you think that this levy should be extended to fund Waking Watches prior to remediation being completed?
Yeah, so one of the things I call for is this developers levy. We think it will raise about £3 billion, not enough to pay for the remediation we're talking about as well. The good news is, as a result of the fantastic work of leaseholders campaigning, the Sunday Times and the Daily Mail have joined the campaign as well. So far, radio silence from the government, but by itself this won't be enough to pay for the Waking Watches. It will help fund for some of the remediation. We need the government to step in relation to the Waking Watches, but the sooner the remediation takes place, the sooner we can get rid of the need for the Waking Watch. And that's why it's really important for the government to understand that actually the remediation is the way to not just address the issues of fire safety, but to avoid additional costs later on as well.
Okay, thank you very much.
Okay, we now have questions from Assembly Member O'Connell regarding police COVID impact.
Thank you for raising this important issue at this important time. Firstly, I want to take this opportunity to thank our police officers, staff and volunteers who've worked tirelessly throughout this pandemic to keep us all safe. It's important we'll continue to recognise and support the dedication of our emergency services. The nature of policing, like all frontline services, that officers inevitably come into contact with the virus and are at risk of infection. COVID has directly impacted officers and staff, and there is a pressure on the MPS workforce, both people sick with the virus and with people needing to self-isolate if they come into contact with it. Latest figures show 12.9% of officers and staff were either sick or self-isolating. That's around 5,200 people, around 1,700 of whom are absent for reasons related to COVID. Many of those self-isolation are able to work from home. To manage the absences and ensure the MPS continues to deliver frontline policing, it's had to flex resources across London. That's why I support the Commissioner in her calls, and I've written to the Secretary of State for Health and the JCVI asking for the prioritisation of those delivering key public services like the police, which will include these key workers who are more vulnerable to infection due to the nature of their public-facing work and because they can't work as effectively from home.
Thank you very much, Mr. Mayor, for your reply. And whilst on, I thank you for your rebuffing earlier about the debate about vaccines and the untruths around that. It's absolutely important that people take up the vaccine. Now, turning to your reply, we had the Deputy Commissioner last week tell us that it's up to 1,700 frontline officers and others self-isolate. So there's an issue here. And a real challenge for the Met leaders to flex their resources, and I hope that you will support them. And I agree very much with your comments around priority for police officers, and I know the Chair, Unamesh and myself are planning also to reinforce that by writing on behalf of the Police and Crime Committee. Ultimately, officers like others are at the highest risk exposure, and indeed we have shameful examples of bad people weaponising their own infections to attack officers. Absolutely disgraceful behaviour by a very small minority of people. We need to protect those that protect us, and I very much agree with you that we should be treating police officers as a priority, and I will really finish there and encourage you to continue that support for our frontline officers, Mr. Mayor.
Can I say, Chair, those words spoken by the member will have been heard by police officers, staff and their families. And I really welcome what he said, the way he said it. And can I just echo what he said? And can I just join him in thanking those police officers and staff? It is unacceptable to ever assault a frontline worker, but it really is the worst when you weaponise this virus. And he will have heard the Deputy Commissioner telling stories about officers being spat at by people claiming to have this virus, but also he will be aware that protest, for very good reasons, is not allowed during this lockdown. We're seeing police officers having to police protests and having to explain to them that they're breaking the law. And so can I thank him for the words he said, which I completely echo and support.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor.
Okay. Question now from the Chairman on reinventing the High Street.
Good morning, Deputy Chair. London's high streets are the beating heart of our communities and an essential part of our economy. The London Recovery Board's High Streets for All mission will support London's boroughs to plan for, safeguard and deliver a diverse, resilient and thriving mix of high streets and town centre activity within easy reach of all Londoners. It will support local authority-led high street partnerships to work with land interests and businesses to better manage assets and experiment with new uses, and support diverse communities in every London borough to revitalise underused high street buildings. I've already increased the Good Growth Fund by £8.1 million to enable its focus on these recovery objectives. In March, alongside London councils, I launched the High Street for All Challenge Fund to support local partnerships and foster experimentation. I also announced my first round of pledges from the Make London programme to enable local community and cultural organisations to participate in high street renewal, and my London plan sets a flexible strategic framework for London's town centres and high streets to ensure growth is sustainable and promotes the compact city model that deliver good growth.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. Do you think that 12-month freeze on business rates, which ends in 2021 tax year, introduced by the Chancellor, adequate to stave off economic disaster, or should this period be extended for a further 12 months?
Absolutely. So I welcome the 12-month freeze in business rates. It's got to be extended for at least another year. But businesses need to know now. Businesses are planning now for next year. There's no point at the end of February announcing an extension. They need to announce it now because I worry businesses who are currently temporarily closed may become permanent closures because there's no extension. And there's an extension on business rates relief to businesses, but also VAT for those businesses in those sectors who need support. And the third thing the government needs to do is provide targeted support for those sectors really adversely affected by the pandemic and by the lockdown.
Thank you. Mr. Mayor, I have an interesting couple of statistics here. One is that in London, we currently have about 1,200 high streets. And within London itself, we have over 128,000 businesses, which account for 23% of London's total business. Given the contribution they make to London's economy, should the Chancellor use near 2 billion of business rates relief returned by supermarkets to help those struggling businesses impacted by the pandemic?
Yeah, it's a good example of switch spending. I want to thank the supermarkets for returning the relief given to them. Really good example of corporate social responsibility. The Chancellor now has monies he wasn't planning to have. And he should use those monies to really help those businesses struggling. You'll be aware that although you mentioned some numbers, actually one of the joys of living in the suburbs is our high streets and our town centres, the quality of life, and we're in danger of losing those. And that's why it's so important the government thinks about the financial benefits of investment, but also the benefits to our way of life by investing in our town centres and high streets.
Interesting, Mr. Mayor, you mentioned quality of life associated and contribution from high streets, and also you mentioned earlier on Good Growth Fund. Do you think that London Plan's Good Growth approach itself is fit for purpose, or do you think that it needs alterations to regenerate high streets, given particularly what we'll be facing come the recovery proper?
Yeah, really good point you raised. I've discussed this with the Deputy Mayor for Planning, Jules Pipe, and we've looked into this. We think the London Plan, once it's finally approved by the government, who've had it for more than a year now, is sufficiently adept and agile to adopt to the changes brought about by COVID. You'll be pleased to know that one of the 9 recovery missions, as you said in your question, is around the high street. And the good news is we're now able to leverage in also local councils' local plans, but also the plans of other parts of the London family as well. But if there's a case in due course for us to amend the London Plan, we can issue what's called supplementary planning guidances. No need to do so at the moment, because we think the London Plan is sufficiently agile and flexible and forward-thinking to address some of the concerns that you otherwise would have.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. I'm done. Thank you.
Now, Assembly Member Gavron, question on permitted development rights.
Thank you. The government's latest proposals would allow any shop, restaurant, office, light industrial premises, nursery, medical centre or indoor sports centre to be converted to a residential use. It makes no distinction between different places, whether the space is occupied or not, or the size of the premises. Existing Article 4 directions would have no power to stop the change of use. I have very serious concerns about these proposals. They could result in the eviction of countless high street businesses, disruption to hundreds of thousands of jobs, and the closure of nurseries and medical centres. During the COVID-19 pandemic, we've all seen how communities have come to rely on their local high streets, as Assembly Member Shah alluded to in his last question. We know that the recovery must be a green recovery, and that new ways of working are beginning to emerge, which will require commercial space to be available to be reused imaginatively. The government's proposals would undermine all of this at the worst possible time, encouraging people to use cars more as local shops and childcare disappear, driving up the rents of creative businesses and small enterprises as they seek to invest in future growth, pepper potting high streets with dead frontages that will encourage no footfall, just as local shops and restaurants try to get back on their feet.
Well, thank you for that answer. I do agree with you how radical this change is. I think it's one of the most radical changes in planning that we've seen ever. It means, and you outlined some of it, it means that any building in any use of any size in virtually any part of London could become a block of flats without going through the planning system. The government says that its central objective in bringing in this very radical, all-encompassing PBR right is to, I quote, to support housing delivery. Now, how do you think it will support housing delivery, and what kind of housing will that be, and at what cost to the economy and to London's need for services and jobs?
Yeah, spot on. I think the last 2 comments are really important. There's housing and there's housing. And there's also the unintended consequence of this policy in relation to our economy and jobs. On the housing front, you'll have seen and heard horror stories about some of the homes that have happened through permitted development, poor quality, poor design, not family homes, very little amenity space, if any. And my worry is we're going to see an escalation of those sorts of poor quality homes that don't have any control over the permission process from locally elected councillors and the community. But the other point is, you can't blame a landowner who sees the opportunity of making a quick buck by flipping a property they own that's used for business to residential, because they can make a quick buck doing that. And that's why I think this is a short-sighted, naive policy from the government, and we're urgently asking them to reconsider, because we can see the unintended consequences being really adverse in many parts of our city.
And also, thank you for that answer. And also, of course, no affordable housing.
Well, there's no requirement at all in relation to family homes, genuinely affordable homes, or the sorts of homes a local community needs.
Exactly. It means the PDR right also includes the potential loss of some of our most critical neighbourhood assets, like the sort of thing, nurseries, creches, gyms, surgeries. It just goes on the list. And also, of course, the potential loss of some of our or making a huge dent in some of our most famous shopping and commercial districts. And I just want you to say a little bit more about how you think, because you've just been talking to Navin about the High Streets for All mission, how we're going to recover from Corona and how important that mission is. How can you say a bit more about how it's going to undermine that?
Yeah.
And also just, if I could just fit this in as well, because I probably won't get another question in, is what protections you might be asking for?
So one of the great things that's happened over the last few weeks and months, it's very difficult to talk about silver linings with such an awful pandemic, is London government's working far closer together. And so we've worked with London government, civic society and others, including the business community, about our 9 missions, one of which is around protecting our high streets. The irony is, at a time when councils are working closer together with GLA and others more than ever before, we're having powers taken away from us by central government in relation to this policy that you're asking questions about. And so you could have a great council who get the local community really well, wanting to have a diverse high street, but that opportunity to do so is taken away from them because a landowner, for reasons which you can't blame them for, wants to make a quick buck by flipping it, which they can now do without having to pay any attention to local plans, to heritage, or the diversity of a town centre. And so it makes it much, much harder to have thriving high streets. And I'm really worried you can have residential development through these permitted development, which are out of scale to the local community, but you will be aware of the huge amount of light industrial buildings used by the creatives, used by small businesses who don't make huge amounts of money, and their landowners will be flipping them from light industrial use to poor quality residential use at the worst time possible, when we need to be coming out of this pandemic with a swift recovery so we can have good growth with wealth and prosperity to create good jobs.
Absolutely. And just on the last bit, you are obviously the lobbying, and the planning committee is putting in a response to this, but the lobbying would be, we don't want this to go ahead. But in fact, as you said earlier, all the protections that did exist under PDR are not there anymore. No Article 4s, no sanctions, etc. So what will you be lobbying for in terms of protections?
Yeah, I mean, councils have made it quite clear we're working closely with them and councils about the importance of Article 4. But if you just think about it with 2 good examples, we've heard recently about Oxford Street, about Debenhams and Topshop leaving their 2 flagship buildings in Oxford Street. You can see a situation where in places like that, a landowner who, I'm not suggesting by the way those 2 landowners are, a landowner who wants to make a quick buck could flip those to residential, which should be out of keeping with what Oxford Street needs. And what we should be doing instead is working with the council, with NWEC and others, to have a place that's a destination. And so it takes away the ability of Westminster Council working closely with us to have Oxford Street as a destination. And you can think of other examples across our city where local councils know their patch better than Whitehall civil servants are taking away the ability to do so by having the power to have an Article 4 direction. So we're going to work closely, Nikki, with London councils, work closely with really good businesses across our London and residents to try and lobby the government to change their mind on this policy.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
Right, we're approaching 12:30. So can I ask the colleagues to agree to suspend Standing Order 2.9b in accordance with the provisions of Standing Order 1.1h so that we can continue with the remaining business on the agenda?
Agreed.
Yes.
Agreed.
Thank you very much.
Yes.
That brings us to a question from Deputy Chair Assembly Member Arbour, which is on traffic issues at Kew Green.
Thank you, Chair. Local residents have every right to make their views known to Richmond Council about this and other decisions, and it's for the Council to consider all the feedback they receive, both positive and negative, as part of its decision-making process. The proposals stem from a larger Richmond Council scheme to review parking across the North Kew area following the redevelopment of Brentford Football Club Stadium, which has resulted in increased parking pressure in the area. Richmond Council also temporarily suspended parking along Kew Road in response to the COVID-19 pandemic to extend the operating times of the cycle lane, which was previously only operational from 8 a.m. to 10 a.m, with parked cars allowed in the cycle lane outside of these hours. The current layout is temporary, after which the Council would need to undertake a permanent traffic management order if the measures were to become permanent. The Council has emphasised that the Elizabeth Gate has always been listed on the Kew Gardens website as its preferred drop-off point for coaches, so they've taken steps to ensure this can be accessed in a safe and convenient manner. TfL has been working with Richmond on these proposals, including where they overlap with the TfL road network and how the council and how the cycle lanes will link with Cycleway 9 at Kew Bridge.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. Have you visited Kew Gardens?
Quite often. Or you mean recently?
Recently.
Not in the last few weeks, no. The last time was probably a few months ago when I visited as part of a planning application.
Well, can I urge you to come again and visit Kew, especially in lilac time? It's not very far from Clapham. And when you go, you will notice that the traffic conditions are not as you described when I asked you about this in September. In September, you said that Kew Road was a busy cycle corridor and that Kew Green was a quiet backwater. You will see that neither of those things are true. Currently, when we don't have the COVID situation, though nevertheless the gardens are open, visitors who don't come by train come largely by coach and are dropped off in the Kew Road, which only has buildings on one side. It's a very substantial road and the coach is parked there. The current proposal, which I would suggest to you really is linked to Richmond Council's obsession with cycling. I mean, it's a feature, isn't it, of Liberal Democrats that they are as keen on cycling as you are and TfL are. And that they are suggesting that the buses, the coaches, now park at Kew Green at the Elizabeth Gate. This is a UNESCO World Heritage Site. If those coaches can only drop off people at Kew Green, they're going to create enormous pressure on the traffic and the residential area, which is Kew Green, and is going to have an appalling effect on that. Can I sort of wrap up other things in this? You've mentioned Brentford Football Club and the pressure that, again, when they are playing properly, that will have on Kew Road and Kew Bridge. Can I say that the terrible delays which are still being caused by the closure of Hammersmith Bridge are only going to exacerbate this? So far from being a quiet backwater, Kew Green is going to become a very substantial traffic hub. The coaches which are to be diverted around Kew Green are going to have to come out onto the South Circular Road. They're going to have to go on to Kew Bridge, and this is going to cause very substantial disruption. Can I ask you, please, to reconsider your advice to Richmond Council on this one and say to them that the coaches should continue to park in Kew Road I fear for your reputation on this one, Mr. Mayor. It's an unusual thing for me to say. Currently, Richmond Council is getting all the blame for this, quite rightly, but I fear that if you give this one the nod, you will get the blame, the GLA will get the blame, and coincidentally, I fear that I may get the blame as well. Can I ask you please to look into this one?
Chairman, the member is assiduously raising legitimate concerns from local residents. And I always take on board what he says. He's hugely experienced in these issues. He's right to remind me and those watching, this is the Richmond Council scheme, but there are concerns. And so why don't I ask my Walking and Cycling Commissioner to speak to the Council, Kew Gardens and Assemblymember Arbour. Ward Norman does speak to residents as well, to see if there's a way to navigate the various interests here so we can get to a resolution that satisfies as many people as possible.
Well, thank you very much. Navigate is a very good term for this. And again, can I repeat to you and to all members, do come down to Kew in lilac time. Thank you, Chairman.
Thank you. After that plug, let's move on to question from Assemblymember Arnold, which is on rickets in children.
Thank you, Chair. Every Londoner should have a healthy start in life. It is a source of huge concern that children in London in 2021 are suffering from diseases like rickets, which are entirely preventable and come from not receiving the vitamins you need through diet and sunlight. While the number of people suffering from rickets in the UK is low, over recent years there has been an increase in cases. During autumn and winter, all Londoners are at risk of vitamin D deficiency due to a lack of natural sunlight, and those with darker skin are at greater risk. Current lockdown restrictions and school closures may mean that many children aren't able to spend as much time outside, further exacerbating this issue. Health professionals recommend that everyone in the UK should be taking a vitamin D supplement. Families that qualify for Healthy Start vouchers can access these supplements for free. My Healthy Schools London Healthy Years London programmes champion healthy diets and support settings to embed healthy eating and drinking. This support is more important than ever, with schools and other settings under extreme pressure to adapt to the changing situation. Resources and support are still provided for staff who are teaching from home. The importance of accessing a healthy diet is also recognised through the London Recovery Programme. The Healthy Food, Healthy Weight mission focuses on Londoners' access to healthy, sustainable and culturally appropriate food, and the London Food Board advised me on the food issues and advocates for actions across the capital.
Assemblymember Arnold.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you, Mr. Mayor, for that full and comprehensive answer. And you are right, the NHS has recently changed to advising those who receive a letter from themselves or the DHSC confirming their high risk from coronavirus and over the age of 18 to take vitamin D supplements, and this is a positive step. However, there's been no comments from the government on advice for children, especially those in homes relying on food banks and or free meals, and children of Black and minority ethnic heritage who, as you highlighted, are more likely to be at a higher risk of vitamin D deficiency. So can I urge you to please keep to keep the nutritional needs of these vulnerable children and young people on the list of the issues for your meetings with the London Regional Director of Public Health, as one way forward would be for the government to introduce an outstanding 2012 recommendation from the then Chief Medical Officer of Health, who recommended universal healthy start, who recommended a healthy start vitamin program. And this, as we know, would then enable it to be a matter of course, rather than something that is just highlighted during a pandemic.
Well, Chair, can I thank the member for raising again an issue that affects the most vulnerable in our city the most. I've been reading with keen interest recently the excellent work from David Davis MP and Rupert Huck MP on a cross-party basis to highlight this issue. She'll be aware from her rich experience about how in previous years certain foods were fortified with vitamin D to make sure we've got our vitamin D, sufficient vitamin D. I'm worried, I'm speaking to London leaders today from the NHS. I will make sure I mention this to them today in relation to steps that can be taken to make sure we address this issue. It's really important we do. We know for the foreseeable future, our children may not be receiving the sunlight they should receive because they've been asked to stay at home. Even more reason to make sure we find other ways for them to receive their vitamin D.
Absolutely, Mr. Mayor. And government is no stranger to national programmes. One of the first national programmes I worked on as a health visitor was the Asian Mother and Baby campaign. That was evidence-based, and there is, enough evidence out there. This is known, and so, just a vitamin programme that is universal would be so helpful. And at the end of my time, Mr. Mayor, can I move away from you and say to my colleague, Assembly Member and Tony Arbour, that if he will come to Clissold Park to see the blossoming trees in spring, I'll gladly come to Kew once I'm through my vaccination regime.
Chair, I'm sure both members are incredibly experienced, and neither of them, for those watching, are breaking any rules. They're talking about promises after the lockdown is lifted, and they're teasing each other as they always do.
Or one can say that we are collectively promoting great aspects of London, the areas of character, history, heritage, and all of that. So,
sorry, Chair, talking about Jeanette and Tony or their respective parks and blossom trees.
Well,
I did mention heritage. I don't know.
Excuse me, we're national treasures, if you don't mind.
And Victoria Park in East
London. Right. Okay. I'm afraid that there are three questions, 119, 249, and 106. We won't be able to take up as a Conservative group are out of time. That leaves us with a question from Assembly Member Cooper, which is about ambitious targets, or are they empty rhetoric? Mr. Mayor.
Well, firstly, Chair, I'm sure the member, like me, and every single member of the Assembly will be welcoming yesterday's inauguration, which is relevant directly to the issue raised by Leonie Cooper today. It's the first time for ages, actually, Chair, that David Curtin and Peter Whittle haven't mentioned Donald Trump. I wonder why, but there you go. I welcome the government's announcement of a more ambitious target. However, without the necessary policy framework and commitment to funding, this is indeed just empty rhetoric. The government urgently needs to back up its claim with action if we're going to tackle the climate emergency. And the reason I refer to the inauguration, Chair, is you'll know one of the executive orders signed by President Biden was recommitting America to the Paris Climate Agreement, which is really good news and bodes well for COP26 later on this year. The committee said that the UK needs to spend £50 billion each year to achieve net zero. This is less than 1% of GDP and would be investment that pays back in terms of jobs, growth and reduced inequalities, but the government is not doing this. The government's recently announced a 10-point plan only commits to spending £12 billion this Parliament, when London alone requires £61 billion in total to get to net zero. France and Germany have committed to roughly £30 billion and £40 billion respectively to their green recovery packages. Our government urgently needs to show that level of ambition. With the limited powers at my disposal, I can only deliver around half the actions needed to address the climate change and continue to call for powers and funding to be devolved to London, ensuring we get our fair share of funds.
Well, Mr. Mayor, I'm glad you noticed the executive order to re-enter the Paris Agreement being signed. I must say it's slightly off topic for the rest of my question, except of course it isn't, in the sense that the context of all of this is the world needing to take effective action to tackle the climate emergency. The National Audit Office stressed in their Achieving Net Zero report that arm's length bodies, regulators and local authorities all have critical roles in the achievement of net zero. So it's very much a joint activity that we need to undertake. And I just wondered if you could quickly outline for us what discussions the government has had with you regarding achievement of the target of carbon neutral by 2030, our local London target. We made a declaration of a climate emergency in the Assembly, one of the first actually nationally, but also now, you know, it has to be our national target, doesn't it?
Absolutely. We've had very little discussion with the government, not for want of trying from us. The last substantive engagement was when Michael Gove had that job in cabinet, and we had really good engagements with him when he had the job. Very little since then. I think when you look at some of the national pots of money that's available around this area, we get very little of that, whether it's building retrofit or vehicle excise duty. I've put forward a submission to the government in relation to both the comprehensive spending review and also the budget in relation to a clean air fund, in relation to electrification of our buses, in relation to local decarbonisation projects, in relation to electric vehicle charging infrastructure. If we get support from the government, we can do much, much more. The reality is we aren't going to get to zero carbon by 2030 without government support in relation to resources and powers. And the reality is, I think Joe Biden being elected president and him re-signing the Paris Climate Change Agreement may kickstart this government responding more urgently to this really pressing issue.
I mean, I took from your previous answer to, I think it was Assembly Member Devonish who was asking about Coventry and Oxford. And of course, they are getting that support from government that we don't get. We are net contributors, only one-way street into the funding into Highways England, which is a bit disappointing. Overall, how much funding would you say that London needs in order to achieve net zero by 2030? And you know, how much of that at all is being offered by the government? It's very little, isn't it?
Well, it's just worth reminding ourselves that actually this is a lost leader. Putting money in now not only saves our planet and addresses the issue of the climate emergency and climate change, but it leads to more jobs being created, more people paying taxes, saving money, saving bills, and so forth. I'll give you an example in relation to buses. If we were to get the support we need for electrifying our buses, it means jobs across the country, 3,000 jobs across the country, from Falkirk to Leeds to Scarborough to Ballymena. In relation to making London net zero by 2030, we've calculated we need roughly £60 billion, which might seem like a lot of money because it is a lot of money, but the reality is we get that back and some over the course of that coming period. And it's a good example of investing to get money back in the medium to long term.
Absolutely. I mean, I think a lot of local authorities lashed out on putting in LED bulbs into street lamps, but of course the payback is that you spend the money up front on the capital costs, but then later on you spend so much less on the revenue costs. And I think that's a lesson for all of us. Actually, buying an electric vehicle costs more in the first place, but of course when you're running it, the running costs are so much less than putting the fossil fuel, the petrol, into it later. I mean, you've been doing an awful lot in London to improve the quality of London's air, from introducing the T-charge, the Central London ULEZ, scrappage schemes to assist people. Now, how helpful would it be to have a Clean Air Act for the whole of the country, and to have some sort of scrappage scheme nationally, so that we can really start to help people move forward into, if they still want to have a private vehicle rather than going down the route of using public transport or using active travel or joining a car club. How much would that help Londoners and the rest of the country to move forward more quickly towards these really important goals?
Well, I think your question and its contents, and hopefully my answer, is a good illustration of the difference politicians can make and the reason why politics matters. And so at every step over the last 4.5 years, you and I have been opposed by the Conservative group in relation to this issue. Yet our policies have led to a 94% reduction in the number of Londoners living in areas exceeding the legal limits of nitrogen dioxide, opposed every step of the way by the Tory member standing to be the mayor on May the 6th. And so you're spot on to remind me of the difference politics can make with the right sort of politician in the position of power and influence. But secondly, that shouldn't be the limit of our ambition. And with a new Clean Air Act, I think we can make real progress going forward, because our powers are limited in relation to what we've got control over, but also the resources are limited. So if we had more powers to do roadside, to do construction, to do buildings, to do the river, and with the resources, we could address 100% of the issues that lead to poor quality air, rather than a maximum of 50%. And that's why we're lobbying the government for a new Clean Air Act with powers and resources, but also an independent watchdog, because we've left the EU now, And so question, who's the watchdog that makes sure the government, councils and me are held to account?
Well, and a watchdog with some teeth. And finally, Mr. Mayor, you just mentioned the differences between the parties on this, which is a great regret to myself and other members of the Labour group on the Assembly. You know, obviously, we really do need to expand the ULEZ from the central London ULEZ in October 2021 out to the north and south circulars, don't we? And it would be a disaster for London's air if that didn't happen, wouldn't it?
So let me just remind you, the Conservative government want us to extend the congestion charge up to the north and the south circular. I say no to that, but I say yes to extending the ultra-low emission zone up to the north and south circular. So you vote Tory, you pay more for driving your car. You vote Labour, you get good quality air.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. Thank you.
Right. We now move on to the last question for the session today, and that is from Assembly Member Russell on surface water flooding.
235,000 properties in London are at significant risk of surface water flooding. Through the London Environment Strategy and our Green New Deal Recovery Mission, we're working to reduce the risk of surface water flooding to make the capital more climate resilient and protect vulnerable Londoners. This includes tackling urban water management, improving green spaces, adapting the built environment and raising awareness through events like London Flood Awareness Week. Urban areas like London receive less government funding to tackle flooding. By working with 6 pilot boroughs to quantify the benefits of small schemes, our officers have helped to secure £1 million of new funding for sustainable drainage schemes, paving the way for the approach to be rolled out across London. My Greener City and Grow Back Greener funds have contributed over £13 million since 2016 to green infrastructure projects that help London adapt to climate change, of which £1.8 million supports over 40 projects around surface water flood risk. Our officers have produced guidance on how to prepare for climate change and flooding for schools and early years settings, social housing, hospitals, commercial and retail buildings, parks and green spaces, as well as providing training to over 200 highway officers on the benefits of sustainable drainage systems. My London plan is reducing surface water flood risk with every new development and over further applications.
Sorry, the Labour group is out of time.
This is a question. This is green time.
Oh, I'm sorry. I'm sorry. I was.
Please, Mr. Mayor, continue and finish. This is, but I want my time back.
You will have your time back. No problem at all.
No,
sorry, I was distracted working from home. One of these problems you have. My apology. Carry on, Mr. Mayor.
Let me just send Caroline. We're just saying integrated water management plans in our housing growth areas are also setting out sustainable strategies for reducing water demand and managing surface water flood risk.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. And I'm particularly concerned about the overwhelming of drainage systems by rain, and that's especially the runoff from roads. And I think, you know, we need a greater sense of urgency on the issue of climate adaptation. I had a report out in summer 2019, London's Warming, which highlighted the risks to London tube stations, with 23 stations at significant risk of flooding from extreme rainfall. So my question is, sustainable drainage systems, or SUDs, are a solution to this problem. In your transport strategy, you have a target to drain 50,000 square metres of surface area on and around roads each year into SUDs, rather than into conventional drains and sewers. Now, you've only reported London's progress over 1 year, which was 2019-20, and that reported 28,000 square metres against a 50,000 target. And that was all from London boroughs, and that was just about half your target. So is that 28,000 square metres all that you've achieved?
No, there's a lot more we've achieved, and it's worth reminding ourselves that actually local authorities are responsible for the local flood, that they're considered the lead local flood authority, but they've got responsibility over their roads, whereas we have responsibility over our roads, the TfL roads as well. So we're working closely with the highways authorities in relation to addressing this issue, and working also with Thames Water. An example of the difference we're making, I'll give you a concrete example of a specific scheme. Or Old Street, around Old Street, our scheme, we're using permeable paving, rain gardens and a green roof. And so you will see more progress, Caroline, going forward in relation to our policies being brought into effect, because you're right, this issue ain't going away. And the more urbanisation we get, if we're not careful, we've seen this over the last few days and weeks, with rainwater, we can have increased amounts of water from the surface running off to our stretched sewers.
Mr. Mayor, it's your target and you're not yet meeting it. Good to hear about Old Street, and I'm really looking forward to going to have a look at it. Now, another location in Islington is the new pedestrianised area at Highbury Corner, where there's a large water tank underneath. But this doesn't seem to be proper sustainable drainage. It's a big tank under the pavement, but judging by the consistent puddles on the surface, it seems to fill rather faster than the nearby trees want to drink from it. So I'm hearing that sustainable drainage systems get value engineered out from schemes during the design and construction process within TfL. Would you do you think a simple commitment from you that every major TfL scheme should have sustainable drainage systems would that remove that risk and help you to meet your target?
Well, we've got, for the first time ever in the London plan, when it's finally approved, a prioritisation in relation to green over grey drainage measures. But for the first time ever, we have a sustainable drainage policy, which wasn't there before. And this sets out a quite clear hierarchy for developers to follow, with the greenest, most sustainable, nature-based, like you said, water going to trees, approaches to manage surface water at the top of the hierarchy. And it's really important that local councils exert the pressure on developers to follow our guidance. You'll be aware only the big schemes come to us, or the schemes on our roads. But you're right, that councils must make sure that developers are following the policies we've set out.
Mr. Mayor, it is absolutely about councils and developers, but it is also about you. And with TfL, you've got the levers, you've got the control. And I think you can show a leadership role here, and particularly if there's good training for TfL officers of the importance that sustainable drainage systems hold for our city. But I am now out of time, so thank you.
Thank you for raising this important issue.
Chair, you're on mute.
Chair, you're muted.
Chair, I think you've been muted.
Yeah, you're muted.
I was simply asking Assembly Member Russell if she's happy that I haven't shortchanged her in terms of time.
Chair, I'm very happy, and I do appreciate you have a very tough job trying to chair this meeting from home, so I'm totally forgiven.
Unfortunately, that's the price I pay for an open plan, lovely environment I have. But there you go. Mr. Mayor, thank you very much for your answers. And
Chair, the Labour group has got 1 minute 42 seconds. Can we use that?
Absolutely. Please go ahead.
Thank you. Mr. Mayor, thank you for your answers. And I think this is a very important debate. Will you commit yourself for GLA officers, TfL officers, sitting round with key members of the London Assembly just to do some further work on this? This is a real good example where we can do some joint work. I think you have got a grip of the issue, despite what the Greens say about you and your targets. I think we've got a plan. It would be really helpful. We in the Labour group have done a report on flooding. Can we sit round the table with your officers and work through some of these issues to actually gain a better understanding, so we don't have to answer these questions? And it's a yes and no, I think.
Absolutely. Just to remind ourselves that we published the first ever London Sustainable Drainage Action Plan when I became mayor. So it's an important issue. We've got a grip on it, and I don't complain at all about Caroline playing a bit of party politics. But she's aware privately, if not publicly, about the good work we've done over the last 4.5 years in this issue.
Thank you.
Right, it seems, Mr. Mayor, this time you can actually go. And thank you very much.
Thank you all very much.
Thank you
Stay safe,
for your
everyone.
time.
Thanks.
Thank you. Right, so finally, can I ask the Assembly to agree the motion which is set out on the agenda, which is in my name, that the Assembly knows the answers to the questions asked?
Agreed.
Agreed. Okay. The date of next meeting, the next scheduled meeting of the London Assembly will be the plenary draft budget meeting, taking place as a virtual meeting at 10 a.m. on Wednesday, 27th of January. Last item, there is no other urgent business, so I'm happy to conclude this meeting, and thank you everyone for your time as well.
Thank you, Chair.
Thank you, Chair.
Thanks, Chair.
GLA Chamber